Section 42 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 42. Löb Schapiro. Born about 1880 in the government of Kiev, Little Russia. Came to Chicago in 1906 and to New York for a short time in 1907-1908. Now, 1912, in business in Switzerland. Contributor to Die Zukunft, New York. Collected works, Novellen, 1 volume, Warsaw, 1910. If It Was a Dream, by Löb Schapiro. Yes, it was a terrible dream, but when one is only 9 years old, one soon forgets, and Maya was 9 and a few weeks before it came to pass. Yes, and things had happened in the house every now and then to remind one of it, but then Maya lived more out of doors than indoors in the wild streets of New York. Tartilov and New York. What a difference! New York had supplanted Tartilov, effaced it from his memory. There remained only a faint, occasional recollection of that horrid dream, if it really was a dream. It was this way. Maya dreamt that he was sitting in Cheder, learning, but more for show's sake than seriously, because during the Yamim Noraim, near the close of the session, the Rabbi grew milder, and the Cheder less hateful. And as he sat there and learnt, he heard a banging of doors in the street, and through the window saw Jews running to and fro, as if bereft of their senses, fleeing themselves hither and thither, exactly like leaves in a gale, or as when a witch rises from the ground in a column of dust, and whirls across the road so suddenly and unexpectedly that it makes one's flesh creep. And at the sight of this running up and down in the street, the Rebbe collapsed in his chair, white as death, his underlip trembling. Maya never saw him again. He was told later that the Rebbe had been killed, but somehow it gave him no pleasure. Although the Rebbe used to beat him, neither did it particularly grieve him. It probably made no great impression on his mind. After all, what did it mean exactly, killed? And the question slipped out of his head unanswered, together with the Rebbe, who was gradually forgotten. And then the real horror began. There were 2 days hiding away in the mikveh, he and some other little boys and a few older people, without food, without drink, without father and mother. Maya was not allowed to get out and get home, and once, when he screamed, they nearly suffocated him, after which he sobbed and whimpered, unable to stop crying all at once. Now and then he fell asleep, and when he woke everything was just the same, and all through the terror and the misery he seemed to hear only one word, Goyim, which came to have a very definite and terrible meaning for him. Otherwise everything was in a maze, and as far as seeing goes, he really saw nothing at all. Later, when they came out again, nobody troubled about him, or came to see after him, and a stranger took him home. And neither his father nor his mother had a word to say to him, any more as if he had just come home from Cheder, as on any other day. Everything in the house was broken. They had twisted his father's arm and bruised his face. His mother lay on the bed, her fair hair tossed about, and her eyes half closed, her face pale and stained, and something about her whole appearance so rumpled and sluttish. It reminded one of a tumbled bedquilt. His father walked up and down the room in silence, looking at no one, his bound arm in a white sling, and when Maya, conscious of some invisible calumny, burst out crying, his father only gave him a gloomy, irritated look, and continued to span the room as before. In about 3 weeks' time they sailed for America. The sea was very rough during the passage, and his mother lay the whole time in her berth and was very sick. Maya was quite fit, and his father did nothing but pace the deck, even when it poured with rain, till they came and ordered him downstairs. Maya never knew exactly what happened, but once a Gentile on board the ship passed a remark on his father, made fun of him or something, and his father drew himself up and gave the other a look, nothing more than a look, and the Gentile got such a fright that he began crossing himself, and he spit out, and his lips moved rapidly. To tell the truth, Maya was frightened himself by the contraction of his father's mouth, the grind of his teeth, and by his eyes, which nearly started from his head. Maya had never seen him look like that before, and soon his father was once more pacing the deck, his head down, his wet collar turned up, his hands in his sleeves, and his back slightly bent. When they arrived in New York City, Maya began to feel giddy, and it was not long before the whole of Tartilov appeared to him like a dream. It was in the beginning of winter, and soon the snow fell, the fresh white snow, and it was something like. Maya was now a boy, and went to school, made snowballs, slid on slides, built little fires in the middle of the street, and nobody interfered. He went home to eat and sleep, and spent what you may call his life in the street. In their room were cold, piercing draughts, which made it feel dreary and dismal. Maya's father, a lean, large-boned man with a dark brown face and a black beard, had always been silent, and it was but seldom he had said as much as, "Are you there, Zipper? Do you hear me, Zipper?" But now his silence was frightening. The mother, on the other hand, used to be full of life and spirits, skipping about the place, and it was Sholem here and Sholem there, and her tongue wagging merrily. And suddenly there was an end to it all. The father only walked back and forth over the room, and she turned to look after him like a child in disgrace, and looked, as though forever wanting to say something and never daring to say it. There was something new in her look, something dog-like. Yes, on my word, something like what there was in the eyes of Mishka, the dog with which Maya used to play over there, in that little town in dreamland. Sometimes Maya, waking suddenly in the night, heard, or imagined he heard, his mother sobbing, while his father lay in the other bed, puffing at his cigar, but so hard it was frightening, because it made a little fire every time in the dark, as though of itself in the air, just over the place where his father's black head must be lying. Then Maya's eyes would shut of themselves, his brain was confused, and his mother and the glowing sparks and the whole room sank away from him, and Maya dropped off to sleep. Twice that winter his mother fell ill. The first time it lasted 2 days, the second 4, and both times the illness was dangerous. Her face glowed like an oven, her lower lip bled beneath her sharp white teeth, and yet wild, terrifying groans betrayed what she was suffering, and she was often violently sick, just as when they were at sea. At those times she looked at her husband with the eyes in which there was no prayer. Mishka once ran a thorn deep into his paw, and he squealed and growled angrily and sucked his paw as though he were trying to swallow it, thorn and all, and the look in his eyes was the look of Maya's mother in her pain. In those days his father, too, behaved differently, for instead of walking to and fro across the room, he ran, puffing incessantly at his cigar, his brow like a thundercloud, and occasional lightnings flashing from his eyes. He never looked at his wife, and neither of them looked at Maya, who then felt himself utterly wretched and forsaken. And, it is very odd, but it was just on these occasions that Maya felt himself drawn to his home. In the street things were as usual, but at home it was like being in shul during the solemn days, at the blowing of the ram's horn, when so many tall fathers stand with tallis over their heads and hold their breath, and when out of the distance there comes unfolding over the heads of the people the long, loud blast of the shofar. And both times when his mother recovered, the shadow that lay on their home had darkened. His father was gloomier than ever, and his mother, when she looked at him, had a still more crushed and dog-like expression, as though she were lying outside in the dust of the street. The snowfalls became rarer, then they ceased altogether, and there came into the air a feeling of something new. What exactly it would have been hard for Maya to say. However, it was something good, very good, for everyone in the street was glad of it. One could see that by their faces, which were more lightsome and gay. On Erev Pesach, the sky of home cleared a little too. Street and house joined hands through the windows, opened now for the first time since winter set in, and this neighbourly act of theirs cheered Maya's heart. His parents made preparations for Pesach, and poor little preparations they were. There was no matzah baking with its merry to-do. A packet of cold, stale matzah was brought into the house. There was no pail of beetroot soup in the corner, covered with a coarse cloth of unbleached linen. No dusty china service was fetched from the attic, where it had lain many years, between one Passover and another. His father brought in a dinner service from the street, one he had bought cheap, and of which the pieces did not match. But the exhilaration of the festival made itself felt for all that, and warmed their hearts. At home in Tartilov it had happened once or twice that Maya had lain in his little bed with eyes open, staring stock-still with terror into the silent blackness of the night, and feeling as if he were the only living soul in the whole world, that is, the whole house. And the sudden crow of a cock would be enough on these occasions to send a warm current of relief and security through his heart. His father's face looked a little more cheerful. In the daytime, while he dusted the cups, his eyes had something pensive in them, but his lips were set so that you thought, "There, now they're going to smile." The mother danced the matzah pancakes up and down in the kitchen, so that they chattered and gurgled in the frying pan. When a neighbour came in to borrow a cooking pot, Maya happened to be standing beside his mother. The neighbour got her pot, and the women exchanged a few words about the coming holiday, and then the neighbour said, "So we shall soon be having a rejoicing at your house," and with a wink and a smile she pointed at his mother with her finger, whereupon Maya remarked for the first time that her figure had grown round and full. But he had no time just then to think it over, for there came a sound of broken china from the next room. His mother stood like one knocked on the head, and his father appeared in the door and said, "Go, go." His voice sent a quiver through the window panes, as if a heavy wagon were just crossing the bridge outside at a trot. The startled neighbour turned and whisked out of the house. Maya's parents looked ill at ease in their holiday garb, with the face of mourners. The whole ceremony of the Passover Seder was spoiled by an atmosphere of the last meal on the eve of Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the temple. And when Maya, with the indifferent voice of one hired for the occasion, sang out, "Ma nishtana haloila hazeh mikol halelos," his heart shrank together. There was the same hush around him as there is in shul when an orphan recites the first Kaddish for his dead parents. His mother's lips moved, but gave forth no sound. From time to time she wetted a finger with her tongue, and turned over leaf after leaf in her service book, and from time to time a large bright tear fell over her beautiful but depressed face onto the book, or the white tablecloth, or her dress. His father never looked at her. Did he see she was crying, Maya wondered? Then, how strangely he was reciting the Haggadah. He would chant a portion in a long, drawn-out fashion, and suddenly his voice would break, sometimes with a gurgle, as though a hand had seized him by the throat and closed it. Then he would look silently at his book, or his eye would wander round the room with a vacant stare. Then he would start intoning again, and again his voice would break. They ate next to nothing, said grace to themselves in a whisper, after which the father said, "Maya, open the door." Not without fear and the usual uncertainty as to the appearance of the prophet Elijah, whose goblet stood filled for him on the table, Maya opened the door. "Pour out thy wrath upon the Gentiles who do not know thee." A slight shudder ran down between Maya's shoulders, for a strange, quite unfamiliar voice had sounded through the room from one end to the other, shot up against the ceiling, flung itself down again, and gone flapping round the four walls like a great wild bird in a cage. Maya hastily turned to look at his father, and felt the hair bristle on his head with fright. Straight and stiff as a screwed-up fiddle-string, there stood beside the table a wild figure in a snow-white robe, with a dark beard, a broad bony face, and a weird black flame in the eye. The teeth were ground together, and the voice would go over into a plaintive roar like that of a hungry, bloodthirsty animal. His mother sprang up from her seat, trembling in every limb, stared at him for a few seconds, and then threw herself at his feet. Catching hold of the edge of his robe with both hands, she broke into lamentation. "Shloime, Shloime, you'd better kill me! Shloime, kill me! Oi, misfortune!" Maya felt as though a large hand with long fingernails had introduced itself into his inside and turned it upside down with one fell twist. His mouth opened widely and crookedly, and a scream of childish terror burst from his throat. Tartilov had suddenly leapt wildly into view. Affrighted Jews flew up and down the streets like leaves in a storm. The white-faced Rabbi sat in his chair, his underlip trembling. His mother lay on her bed, looking all pulled about like a rumpled counterpane. Maya saw all this as clearly and sharply as though he had seen it before his eyes. He felt and knew that it was not all over, that it was only just beginning, that the calamity, the great calamity, the real calamity, was still to come, and might at any moment descend upon their heads like a thunderbolt. Only what it was he did not know, or ask himself. And a second time a scream of distraught and helpless terror escaped his throat. A few neighbours, Italians, who were standing in the passage by the open door, looked on in alarm, and whispered among themselves, and still the wild curses filled the room, one minute loud and resonant, the next with the spiteful gasping of a man struck to death. Mighty God, pour out thy wrath upon the peoples who have no God in their hearts. Pour out thy wrath upon the lands where thy name is unknown. He has devoured my body. He has laid waste my house. Thy wrath shall pursue them, o'ertake them, destroy them from under thy heavens. End of If It Was a Dream by Löb Schapiro. Section 43 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 43. Shalom Asch, born 1881 in Kutno, Government of Warsaw, Russian Poland. Jewish education and Hasidic surroundings. Began to write in 1900, earliest works being in Hebrew. Sipurim was published in 1903 and A Shtetl in 1904. Wrote his first drama in 1905, distinguished for realism, love of nature, and description of parochial Jewish life in the villages. Playwright. Dramas Gott von Nekemo, Mashiach Zeiten, etc. Collected works Schriffen, Warsaw, 1908 to 1912, in course of publication. A Simple Story by Sholem Asch. Fagel, like all young girls, is fond of dressing and decking herself out. She has no time for these frivolities during the week. There is work in plenty, Kenny Hora, and sewing to do. Rent is high, and times are bad. The father earns but little, and there is a deal wanting towards her 300 roubles dowry, beside which her mother trenches on it occasionally, on Sabbath, when the family purse is empty. There are as many marriageable young men as dogs, only every dog wants a fat bone, comes into her head. She dislikes much thinking. She's a young girl and a pretty one. Of course, one shouldn't be conceited, but when she stands in front of the glass, she sees her bright face and rosy cheeks and the fall of her black hair. But she soon forgets it all, as though she were afraid that to rejoice in it might bring her ill luck. Sabbath is quite another thing. There is time and to spare, and on Sabbath Fagel's toilette knows no end. The mother calls, "There, Fagel, that's enough. You will do very well as you are." But what should old-fashioned women like her know about it? Anything will do for them. Whether you've got a hat and a jacket on or not, they're just as pleased. But a young girl like Fagel knows the difference. He is sitting out there on the bench, he, Eliezer, with a party of his mates, casting furtive glances, which he thinks nobody sees, and nudging his neighbour. "Look, fire and flame!" And she, Fagel, behaves as though unaware of his presence, walks straight past, as coolly and unconcernedly as you please, and as though Eliezer might look and look his eyes out after her, take his own life, hang himself, for all she cares. But, oh, Fagel, the vexation and the heartache when one day you walk past and he doesn't look at you but at Malka, who has a new hat and jacket that suit her about as well as a veil suits a dog, and yet he looks at her, and you turn round again, and yet again, pretending to look at something else because it isn't proper, but you just glance over your shoulder, and he is still looking after Malka, his whole face shining with delight, and he nudges his mate as to say, "Do you see?" Oh, Fagel, you need a heart of adamant if it is not to burst in twain with mortification. However, no sooner has Malka disappeared down a sidewalk than he gets up from the bench, dragging his mate along with him, and they follow, arm in arm, follow Fagel like her shadow, to the end of the avenue, where, catching her eye, he nods a good Shabbos. Fagel, with a supercilious tip-tilt of her head, as much as to say, "It's all the same to me, I'm sure. I'll just go down this other avenue for a change." And lo and behold, if she happens to look around, there is Eliezer too, and he follows like a wearisome creditor. And then, oh, Fagel, such a lovely, blissful feeling comes over you. Don't look, take no notice of him. Walk ahead, stiffly and firmly, with your head high. Let him follow and look at you. And he looks, and he follows. He would follow you to the world's end, into the howling desert. Oh, how lovely it feels! But once, on a Sabbath evening, walking in the gardens with a girl-friend and he following, Fagel turned aside down a dark path and sat down on a bench behind a bushy tree. He came and sat down too, at the other end of the bench. Evening. The many branching trees overshadow and obscure. It grows dark. They are screened and hidden from view. A breeze blows lightly and pleasantly and cools the air. They feel it good to be there. Their hearts beat in the stillness. Who will say the first word? He coughs, ahem, to show that he is there, but she makes no sign, implying that she neither knows who he is nor what he wants, and has no wish to learn. They are silent. They only hear their own beating hearts and the wind in the leaves. "I beg your pardon, do you know what time it is?" "No, I don't," she replies stiffly, meaning, "I know quite well what you're after, but don't be in such a hurry. You won't get anything the sooner." The girl beside her gives her a nudge. "Did you hear that?" she giggles. Fagel feels a little annoyed with her. Does the girl think she is the object? And she presently prepares to rise, but remains as though glued to the seat. "A beautiful night, isn't it?" "Yes, a beautiful evening." And so the conversation gets into swing, with a question from him and an answer from her, on different subjects, first with fear and fluttering of the heart, then they get closer one to another and become more confidential. When she goes home, he sees her to the door. They shake hands and say, "Till we meet again." And they meet a second and a third time, for young hearts attract each other like a magnet. At first, of course, it's accidental. They meet by chance in the company of two other people, a girl-friend of hers and a chum of his, and then, little by little, they come to feel that they want to see each other alone, all to themselves, and they fix upon a quiet time and place. And they met. They walked away together, outside the town, between the sky and the fields, walked and talked, and again, conscious that the talk was an artificial one, were even more gladly silent. Evening, and the last sunbeams were gliding over the ears of corn on both sides of the way. Then a breeze came along, and the ears swayed and whispered together as the two passed on between them down the long road. Night was gathering. It grew continually darker, more melancholy, more delightful. "I've been wanting to know you for a long time, Fagel." "I know. You followed me like a shadow." They are silent. "What are you thinking about, Fagel?" "What are you thinking about, Eliezer?" And they plunge once more into a deep converse about all sorts of things, and there seems to be no reason why it should ever end. It grows darker and darker. They have come to walk closer together. Now he takes her hand. She gives a start, but his hand steals further and further into hers. Suddenly, as dropped from the sky, he bends his face and kisses her on the cheek. A thrill goes through her. She takes her hand out of his and appears rather cross, but he knows it is put on, and very soon she is all right again, as if the incident were forgotten. An hour or two goes by thus, and every day now they steal away and meet outside the town. And Eliezer began to frequent her parents' house. The first time with an excuse. He had some work for Fagel. And then, as people do, he came to know when the work would be done, and Fagel behaved as though she had never seen him before, as though not even knowing who he was, and politely begged him to take a seat. So it came about by degrees that Eliezer was continually in and out of the house, coming and going as he pleased, and without stating any pretext whatsoever. Fagel's parents knew him for a steady young man. He was a skilled artisan, earning a good wage, and they knew quite well why a young man comes to the house of a young girl, but they feigned ignorance, thinking to themselves, let the children get to know each other better. There will be time enough to talk it over afterwards. Evening. A small room, shadows moving on the walls, a new table on which burns a large bright lamp, and sitting beside it, Fagel sewing, and Eliezer reading aloud a novel by Shomer. Father and mother, tired out with a whole day's work, sleep on their beds behind the curtain, which shuts off half the room. And so they sit, both of them, only sometimes Eliezer laughs aloud, takes her by the hand, and exclaims with a smile, "Fagel, what do you want, silly?" "Nothing at all, nothing at all." And she sews on, thinking, "I have got you fast enough, but don't imagine you are taking someone from the street just as she is. There are still 80 rubles wanting to make 300 in the bank." And she shows him her wedding outfit, the shifts and the bedclothes, of which half lie waiting in the drawers. They drew closer one to another. They became more and more intimate, so that all looked upon them as engaged, and expected the marriage contract to be drawn up any day. Fagel's mother was jubilant at her daughter's good fortune, at the prospect of such a son-in-law, such a golden son-in-law. Reb Yankel, her father, was an elderly man, a worn-out peddler, bent sideways with the bag of junk continually on his shoulder. Now he too had a little bit of pleasure, a taste of joy, for which God be praised. Everyone rejoices, Fagel most of all. Her cheeks look rosier and fresher, her eyes darker and brighter. She sits at her machine and sews, and the whole room rings with her voice.
Und was ich hab gewollt, hab ich ausgeführt, soll ich also leben. Ich hab gewollt a schönem Chasen, hat mir Gott gegeben.
In the evening comes Eliezer. Well, what are you doing? What should I be doing? Wait, I'll show you something. What sort of a thing? She raises from her place, goes to the chest that stands in the stove corner, takes something out of it, and hides it under her apron. Whatever have you got there? He laughs. Why are you in such a hurry to know? She asks, and sits down beside him, brings from under her apron a picture in fine woolwork, Adam and Eve, and shows it him, saying, There, now you see. It was worked by a girl I know, for me, for us. I shall hang it up in our room, opposite the bed. Yours or mine? You wait, Eliezer. You will see the house I shall arrange for you. A paradise, I tell you, just a little paradise. Everything in it will have to shine, so that it will be a pleasure to step inside. And every evening when work is done, we two shall sit together, side by side, just as we are doing now. And he puts an arm around her. And you will tell me everything, all about everything, says she, laying a hand on his shoulder, while with the other she takes hold of his chin and looks into his eyes. They feel so happy, so light at heart. Everything in the house has taken on an air of kindliness. There is a soft, attractive gloss on every object in the room. On the walls and the table, the familiar things make signs to her and speak to her as friend to friend. The two are silent, lost in their own thoughts. Look, she says to him, and takes her bank book out of the chest. 240 roubles already. I shall make it up to 300, and then you won't have to say I took you just as you were. Go along with you, you're very unjust, and I'm cross with you, Fagel. Why? Because I tell you the truth to your face? She asks, looking into his face and laughing. He turns his head away, pretending to be offended. You little silly, are you feeling hurt? I was only joking, can't you see? So it goes on, till her old mother's face peeps out from behind the curtain, warning them that it is time to go to rest, when the young couple bid each other good night. Reb Yankel, Fagel's father, fell ill. It was in the beginning of winter, and there was war between winter and summer. The former sent a snowfall, the latter a burst of sun. The snow turned to mud, and between times it poured with rain by the bucketful. This sort of weather made the old man ill. He became weak in the legs and took to his bed. There was no money for food, and still less for firing, and Fagel had to lend for the time being. The old man lay abed and coughed. His pale, shriveled face reddened. The teeth showed between the drawn lips, and the blue veins stood out on his temples. They sent for the doctor, who prescribed a remedy. The mother wished to pawn their last pillow, but Fagel protested and gave up part of her wages, and when this was not enough, she pawned her jacket. Anything sooner than touch the dowry. and he, Eliezer, came every evening, and they sat down together beside the well-known table in the lamplight. "Why are you so sad, Feigeler?" "How can you expect me to be cheerful with father so ill?" "God will help, Feigeler, and he will get better." "It's 4 weeks since I put a farthing into the savings bank." "What do you want to save for?" "What do I want to save for?" she asked with a startled look, as though something had frightened her. "Are you going to tell me you will take me without a dowry?" "What do you mean by without a dowry? You're worth all the money in the world to me, worth my whole life. What do I want with your money? See here my 5 fingers. They can earn all we need. I have 200 rubles in the bank, saved from my earnings. What do I want with more?" They are silent for a moment, with downcast eyes. "And your mother?" she asks quietly. "Will you please tell me, are you marrying my mother or me? And what concern is she of yours?" Feigele is silent. "I tell you again, I'll take you just as you are, and you'll take me the same, will you?" She puts the corner of her apron to her eyes and cries quietly to herself. There is stillness around. The lamp sheds its brightness over the little room and casts their shadows onto the walls. The heavy sleeping of the old people is audible behind the curtains, and her head lies on his shoulder, and her thick black hair hides his face. "How kind you are, Eliezer," she whispers through her tears, and she opens her whole heart to him, tells him how it is with them now, how bad things are. They have pawned everything, and there is nothing left for tomorrow, nothing but the dowry. He clasps her lovingly and dries her cheeks with her aproned end, saying, "Don't cry, Feigele, don't cry. It will come all right. And tomorrow, mind, you are to go to the post office and take a little of the dowry, as much as you need, until your father, God helping, is well again and able to earn something. And then," she echoes in a whisper, "and then it will all come right." And his eyes flash into hers. "Just as you are," he whispers. And she looks at him, and a smile crosses her face. She feels so happy, so happy. Next morning she went to the post office for the first time with her bank book, took out a few rubles, and gave them to her mother. The mother sighed heavily, and took on a grieved expression. She frowned, and pulled her headkerchief down over her eyes. Old Reb Yankel, lying in bed, turned his face to the wall. The old man knew where the money came from. He knew how his only child had toiled for these few rubles. Other fathers gave money to their children. He took it. It seemed to him as though he were plundering the 2 young people. He had not long to live, and he was robbing them before he died. As he thought on this, his eyes glazed, the veins on his temple swelled, and his face became suffused with blood. His head is buried in the pillow and turns to the wall. He lies and thinks these thoughts. He knows that he is in the way of the children's happiness, and he prays that he might die, and she, Feigele, would come into a fortune all at once, to have a lot of money, to be as rich as any great lady. And then suppose she had 1,000 rubles now, this minute, and he came in, "There, take the whole of it, see if I love you, there, take it, and then you needn't say you love me for nothing, just as I am." They sit beside the father's bed, she and her Eliezer. Her heart overflows with content. She feels happier than she ever felt before. There are even tears of joy on her cheeks. She sits and cries, hiding her face with her apron. He takes her caressingly by the hand, repeating in his kind, sweet voice, "Feigele, stop crying, Feigele, please." The father lies turned with his face to the wall, and the beating of his heart is heard in the stillness. They sit, and she feels confidence in Eliezer. She feels that she can rely upon him. She sits and drinks in his words. She feels him rolling the heavy stones off from her heart. The old father has turned around and looked at them, and a sweet smile steals over his face, as though he would say, "Have no fear, children. I agree with you. I agree with all my heart." And Feigele feels so happy, so happy. The father is still lying ill, and Feigele takes out 1 ruble after another, 1 5-ruble piece after another. The old man lies and prays and muses, and looks at the children, and holds his peace. His face gets paler and more wrinkled. He grows weaker. He feels his strength ebbing away. Feigele goes on taking money out of the savings bank. The stamps in her book grow less and less. She knows that soon there will be nothing left. Old Reb Yankel wishes in secret that he did not require so much, that he might cease to hamper other people. He spits blood drops, and his strength goes on diminishing, and so do the stamps in Feigele's book. The day he died saw the last farthing of Feigele's dowry disappear after the others. Feigele has resumed her seat by the bright lamp, and sews till far into the night, and with every seam that she sews, something is added to the credit of her new account. This time the dowry must be a larger one, because for every stamp that is added to the account book, there is a new grey hair on Feigele's black head. End of A Simple Story by Sholem Asch. Section 44 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 44. A Jewish Child by Shalom Asch. The mother came out of the bride's chamber and cast a piercing look at her husband, who was sitting beside a finished meal and was making pellets of breadcrumbs previous to saying grace.
"You go talk to her, I haven't a bit of strength left." "So Rachel Leah has brought up children, has she, and can't manage them? Why, people will be pointing at you and laughing. A ruin to your years." "To my years? A ruin to yours. My children, are they? Are they not yours too? Couldn't you stay at home sometimes to care for them and help me to bring them up instead of traipsing around? The black ear knows where and with whom." "Rachel, Rachel, what has possessed you to start such a quarrel with me now? The bridegroom's family will be arriving directly." "And what do you expect me to do, Moishelah, eh? For God's sake, go in to her. We shall be made a laughing stock."
The man rose from the table and went into the next room to his daughter. The mother followed. On the sofa that stood by the window sat a girl about 18, her face hidden in her hands, her arms covered by her loose, thick, black hair. She was evidently crying, for her bosom rose and fell like a stormy sea. On the bed opposite lay the white silk wedding dress, the chuppah kleid, with the black silk shul kleid, and the black stuff morning dress, which the tailor who had undertaken the outfit had brought not so long ago. By the door stood a woman with a black scarf round her head and holding boxes with wigs. "Chanallah, you are never going to do me this dishonour, to make me the talk of the town?" exclaimed the father. The bride was silent. "Look at me, daughter of Moshe Gross. It's all very well for Grenendel Freunder's daughter to wear a wig, but not for the daughter of Moshe Gross. Is that it? And yet Grenendel Freundel might very well think more of herself than you. She's more educated than you are, and has a larger dowry," put in the mother. The bride made no reply. "Daughter, think how much blood and treasure it has cost to help us to a bit of pleasure, and now you want to spoil it for us? Remember, for God's sake, what you are doing with yourself. We shall be excommunicated. The young man will run away home on foot." "Don't be foolish," said the mother, took a wig out of a box from the woman by the door, and approached her daughter. "Let us try on the sheitel. The hair is just the colour of yours." And she laid the strange hair on the girl's head. The girl felt the weight, put up her fingers to her head, met among her own soft, cool, living locks the strange dead hair of the wig, stiff and cold, and it flashed through her, who knows where the head to which this hair belonged is now? A shuddering enveloped her, and as though she had come into contact with something unclean, she snatched off the wig, threw it onto the floor, and hastily left the room. Father and mother stood and looked at each other in utter dismay. The day after the wedding ceremony, the bridegroom's mother rose early, and bearing large scissors and the wig and a hood which she had brought from her home as a present for the bride, she went to dress the latter for the breakfast. But the groom's mother remained outside the room, because the bride had locked herself in and would open her door to no one. The groom's mother ran calling aloud for help to her husband, who, together with a dozen uncles and brothers-in-law, was still sleeping soundly after the evening's festivity. She then sought out the bridegroom, an 18-year-old boy, with his mother's milk still on his lips, who, in a silk caftan and fur cap, was moving about the room in a bewildered fashion, his eyes on the ground, ashamed to look anyone in the face. In the end she fell back on the mother of the bride, and these two went into her together, having forced open the door between them. "Why did you lock yourself in, dear daughter? There is no need to be ashamed." "Marriage is a Jewish institution," said the groom's mother, and kissed her future daughter-in-law on both cheeks. The girl made no reply. "Your mother-in-law has brought you a sheitel and a hood for the procession to the shul," said her own mother. The band had already struck up the "Good Morning" in the next room. "Come now, Kalashi, Kala Leben, the guests are beginning to assemble." The groom's mother took hold of the plaits in order to loosen them. The bride bent her head away from her and fell on her own mother's neck. "I can't, Mama Leben. My heart won't let me, Mama Kron." She held her hair with both hands to protect it from the other's scissors.
For God's sake, my daughter, my life," begged the mother. "In the other world you will be plunged for this into rivers of fire. The apostate who wears her own hair after marriage will have her own locks torn out with red-hot pincers," said the other with the scissors. A cold shiver went through the girl at these words. "Mother life, mother crown," she pleaded. Her hands sought her hair, and the black, silky tresses fell through them in waves. Her hair, the hair which had grown with her growth and lived with her life, was to be cut off, and she was never, never to have it again. She was to wear strange hair that had grown on another person's head, and no one knows whether that other person was alive or lying in the earth this long time, and whether she might not come any night to one's bedside and whine in a dead voice, "Give me back my hair, give me back my hair." A frost seized the girl to the marrow. She shivered and shook. Then she heard the squeak of scissors over her head, tore herself out of her mother's arms, made one snatch at the scissors, flung them across the room, and said in a scarcely human voice, "My own hair! May God himself punish me!" That day the bridegroom's mother took herself off home again, together with the sweet cakes and the geese which she had brought for the wedding breakfast for her own guests. She wanted to take the bridegroom as well, but the bride's mother said, "I will not give him back to you. He belongs to me already." The following Sabbath they led the bride in procession to the shul, wearing her own hair in the face of all the town, covered only by a large hood. But may all the names she was called by the way find their only echo in some uninhabited wilderness. A summer evening, a few weeks after the wedding. The young man had just returned from the stubel and went to his room. The wife was already asleep, and the soft light of the lamp fell on her pale face, showing here and there among the wealth of silky black hair that bathed it. Her slender arms were flung round her head, as though she feared that someone might come by night to shear them off while she slept. He had come home excited and irritable. This was the 4th week of his married life, and they had not yet called him to the Kiryas HaTorah, the reading of the law. The Chassidim pursued him, and today Chaim Moshe had blamed him in the presence of the whole congregation, and had shamed him because she, his wife, went about in her own hair. "You're no better than a clay image," Reb Chaim Moshe had told him. "What do you mean by a woman saying she won't? It is written, and he shall rule over thee." And he had come home intending to go to her and say, "Woman, it is a precept in the Torah. If you persist in wearing your own hair, I may divorce you without returning the dowry," after which he would pack up his things and go home. But when he saw his little wife asleep in bed, and her pale face peeping out of the glory of her hair, he felt a great pity for her. He went up to the bed and stood a long while looking at her, after which he called softly, "Channelah, Channelah, Channelah." She opened her eyes with a frightened start and looked round in sleepy wonder. "Nosson, did you call? What do you want?" "Nothing, your cap has slipped off," he said, lifting up the white nightcap which had fallen from her head. She flung it on again and wanted to turn toward the wall. "Channelah, I want to talk to you." The words went to her heart.
The whole time since their marriage he had, so to say, not spoken to her. During the day she saw nothing of him, for he spent it in the Bes Hamedrash or in the Stubel. When he came home to dinner, he sat down to table in silence. When he wanted anything, he asked for it, speaking into the air, and when really obliged to exchange a word with her, he did so with his eyes fixed on the ground, too shy to look her in the face. And now he said he wanted to talk to her, and in such a gentle voice, and they two alone together in their room. "What do you want to say to me?" she asked softly. "Channelah," he began, "please don't make a fool of me, and don't make a fool of yourself in people's eyes. Has not God decreed that we should belong together? You are my wife and I am your husband, and is it proper? And what does it look like? A married woman wearing her own hair?" Sleep still half dimmed her eyes, and had altogether clouded her thought and will. She felt helpless, and her head fell lightly towards his breast. "Child," he went on still more gently, "I know you are not so depraved as they say. I know that you are a pious Jewish daughter, and His blessed name will help us, and we shall have pious Jewish children. Put away this nonsense. Why should the whole world be talking about you? Are we not man and wife? Is not your shame mine?" It seemed to her as though someone, at once very far away and very near, had come and was talking to her. Nobody had ever yet spoken to her so gently and confidingly, and he was her husband, with whom she would live so long, and there would be children, and she would look after the house. She leant her head lightly against him. "I know you are very sorry to lose your hair, the ornament of your girlhood. I saw you with it when I was a guest in your home. I know that God gave you grace and loveliness. I know. It cuts me to the heart that your hair must be shorn off. But what is to be done? It is a rule, a law of our religion. And after all, we are Jews. We might even, God forbid, have a child conceived to us in sin. May Heaven watch over and defend us." She said nothing, but remained resting lightly in his arm, and his face lay in the stream of her silky black hair with its cool odour. In that hair dwelt a soul, and he was conscious of it. He looked at her long and earnestly, and in his look was a prayer, a pleading with her for her own happiness, for her happiness and his. "Shall I?" he asked, more with his eyes than with his lips. He went quickly to the drawer and took out a pair of scissors. She laid her head in his lap and gave her hair as a ransom for their happiness, still half asleep and dreaming. The scissors squeaked over her head, shearing off one lock after the other, and Channelah lay and dreamt through the night. On waking next morning, she threw a look into the glass which hung opposite the bed. A shock went through her, and she thought she had gone mad and was in the asylum. On the table beside her lay her shorn hair, dead. She hid her face in her hands, and the little room was filled with the sound of weeping. End of A Jewish Child by Sholem Asch. Section 45 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 45. A Scholar's Mother by Sholem Asch. The market lies 4 square, surrounded on every side by low, whitewashed little houses. From the chimney of the one-storied house opposite the well, and inhabited by the baker, issues thick smoke, which spreads low over the market-place. Beneath the smoke is a flying to and fro of white pigeons, and a tall boy, standing outside the baker's door, is whistling to them. Equally opposite the well are stalls, doors laid across 2 chairs, and covered with fruit and vegetables, and around them women with headkerchiefs gathered round their weary, sunburnt faces in the hottest weather stand and quarrel over each other's wares.
"It's certainly worth my while to stand quarrelling with you, a tramp like you keeping a stall."
Yente, a woman about 40, whose wide lips have just uttered the above, wears a large dirty apron, and her broad red face, with the composed glance of the eyes under the kerchief, gives support to her words.
"Do you suppose you have got the Almighty by the beard? He's mine as well as yours," answers Tauber, pulling her kerchief lower about her ears and angrily stroking down her hair.
A new customer approached Yente's stall, and Tauber, standing by idle, passed the time in vituperations.
"What do I want with the money of a fine lady like you? You'll die like the rest of us, and not a dog will say Kaddish for you,"
she shrieked, and came to a sudden stop, for Tauber had intended to bring up the subject of her own son, Yitzchok, when she remembered that it is against all manners to praise one's own. Yente, measuring out a quarter of peas to her customer, made answer.
"Well, if you were a little superior to what you are, your husband wouldn't have died, and your child wouldn't have to be ashamed of you, as we all know he is."
Whereupon Tauber flew into a rage and shouted,
"Hussy! The idea of my son being ashamed of me! May you be a sacrifice for his littlest fingernail, for you're not worthy to mention his name."
She was about to burst out weeping at the accusation of having been the cause of her husband's death, and of causing her son to be ashamed of her, but she kept back her tears with all her might in order not to give pleasure to Yente. The sun was dropping lower behind the other end of the little town. Jews were hurrying across the market-place to Mincha in the Bes HaMedrash street, and the Cheder boys, just let out, began to gather round the well. Tauber collected her few little baskets in her arms. The doors and the chairs she left in the market-place, nobody would steal them, and with 2 or 3 parting curses to the rude Yente, she quietly quitted the scene. Walking home with her armful of baskets, she thought of her son, Yitzchok. Yente's stinging remarks pursued her. It was not Yente's saying that she had caused her husband's death that she minded. Everyone knew how hard she had worked during his illness. It was her saying that Yitzchok was ashamed of her that she felt in her ribs. It occurred to her that when he came home for the night, he would never touch anything in her house. And thinking this over, she started once more abusing Yente.
"Let her not live to see such a thing, Ribbono Shel Olam, the one Father."
It seemed to her that this fancy of hers, that Yitzchok was ashamed of her, was all Yente's fault. It was all her doing, the witch.
"My child, my Yitzchok, what business is he of yours?"
And the cry escaped her
Ribono shel Olam, take up my quarrel. Thou art a father to the orphaned. Thou shouldst not forgive her this." "Who is that? Whom are you scolding so, Taube?" called out Necha, the rich man's wife, standing in the door of her shop, and overhearing Taube as she scolded to herself on the walk home. "Who should it be, house mistress? Who but the hussy, the abortion, the witch?" answered Taube, pointing with one finger toward the marketplace, and without so much as lifting her head to look at the person speaking to her, she went on her way. She remembered as she walked how that morning, when she went into Necha's kitchen with a fowl, she heard her Yitzchakel's voice in the other room, disputing with Necha's boys over the Talmud. She knew that on Wednesdays Yitzchakel ate his day at Necha's table, and she had taken the fowl there that day on purpose, so that her Yitzchakel would have a good plate of soup, for her poor child was but weakly. When she heard her son's voice, she had been about to leave the kitchen, and yet she had stayed. Her Yitzchakel disputing with Necha's children? What did they know as compared with him? Did they come up to his level? "He will be ashamed of me," she thought with a start, "when he finds me with a chicken in my hand. So his mother is a market woman, they will say. There's a fine study partner for you." But she had not left the kitchen. A child who had never cost a farthing, and she would like to know how much Necha's children cost their parents. If she had all the money that Yitzchakel ought to have cost, the money that ought to have been spent on him, she would be a rich woman too, and she stood and listened to his voice. Oi, he should have lived to see Yitzchakel. It would have made him well. Soon the door opened. Necha's boys appeared, and her Yitzchakel with them. His cheeks flamed. "Good morning," he said feebly, and was out at the door in no time. She knew that she had caused him vexation, that he was ashamed of her before his companions, and she asked herself, her child, her Yitzchakel, who had suckled her milk, what had Necha to do with him? And she had poured out her bitterness of heart upon Yente's head for this also, that her son had cost her parents nothing, and was yet a better scholar than Necha's children. Once more she exclaimed, "Ribono shel Olam, avenge my quarrel, pay her out for it, let her not live to see another day." Passers-by, seeing a woman walking and scolding aloud, laughed. Night came on. The little town was darkened. Taube reached home with her armful of baskets, dragged herself up the steps, and opened the door. "Mame, it's Mame," came voices from within. The house was full of smoke. The children clustered round her in the middle of the room, and never ceased calling out, "Mame!" One child's voice was tearful. "Where have you been all day?" Another's more cheerful. "How nice it is to have you back!" And all the voices mingled together into one. "Be quiet! You don't give me time to draw my breath!" cried the mother, laying down the baskets. She went to the fireplace, looked about for something, and presently the house was illuminated by a smoky lamp. The feeble shimmer lighted only the part round the hearth, where Taube was kindling 2 pieces of stick. An old dusty sewing machine beside a bed, sign of a departed tailor, and a single bed opposite the lamp, strewn with straw,
on which lay various fruits, the odour of which filled the room. The rest of the apartment, with the remaining beds, lay in shadow. It is 1.5 years since her husband, Laser, the tailor, died. While he was alive, but when his cough had increased and he could no longer provide for his family, Taube had started earning something on her own account, and the worse the cough, the harder she had to toil, so that by the time she became a widow, she was already used to supporting her whole family. The eldest boy, Yitzchok, had been the one consolation of Laser the tailor's cheerless existence, and Laser was comforted on his deathbed to think that he should leave a good Kaddish behind him. When he died, the householders had pity on the desolate widow, collected a few roubles so that she might buy something to traffic with, and seeing that Yitzchok was a promising boy, they placed him in the Bes HaMedrash, arranged for him to have his daily meals in the houses of the rich, and bade him pass his time over the Talmud. Taube, when she saw her Yitzchok taking his meals with the rich, felt satisfied. A weakly boy, what could she give him to eat? There, at the rich man's table, he had the best of everything, but it grieved her that he should eat in strange rich houses. She herself did not know whether she had received a kindness or the reverse when he was taken off her hands. One day, sitting at her stall, she spied her Yitzchok emerging from the shul with his tefillin bag under his arm, and go straight into the house of Reb Zintel the rich to breakfast, and a pang went through her heart. She was still on terms then with Yente, because immediately after the death of her husband everyone had been kind to her, and she said, "Believe me, Yente, I don't know myself what it is. What right have I to complain of the householders? They have been very good to me and to my child, made provision for him in rich houses, treated him as if he were no ordinary market woman's son, but the child of gentlefolk. And every day, when I give the other children their dinner, I forget, and I lay a plate for my Yitzchok. And when I remember that he has his meals at other people's hands, I begin to cry." "Go along with you for a foolish woman," answered Yente. "How would he turn out if he was left to you? What is a poor person to give a child to eat, when you come to think of it?" "You are right, Yente," Taube replied. "But when I portion out the dinner for the others, it cuts me to the heart." And now, as she sat by the hearth cooking the children's supper, the same feeling came over her, that they had stolen her Yitzchok away. When the children had eaten and gone to bed, she stood the lamp on the table and began mending a shirt for Yitzchok. Presently the door opened, and he, Yitzchok, came in. Yitzchok was about 14, tall and thin, his pale face telling out sharply against his black cloak beneath his black cap. "Good evening," he said in a low tone. The mother gave up her place to him, feeling that she owed him respect without knowing exactly why, and it was borne in upon her that she and her poverty together were a misfortune for Yitzchok. He took a book out of the case, sat down, and opened it. The mother gave the lamp a screw, wiped the globe with her apron, and pushed the lamp nearer to him. "Will you have a glass of tea, Yitzchok?" she asked softly, wishful to serve him. "No, I've just had some." "Or an apple?" He was silent. The mother cleaned a plate, laid 2 apples on it and a knife, and placed it on the table beside him. He peeled one of the apples as elegantly as a grown-up man, repeated the brocha aloud, and ate. When Taube had seen Yitzchok eat an apple, she felt more like his mother, and drew a little nearer to him. And Yitzchok, as he slowly peeled the second apple, began to talk more amiably. "Today I talked with the Dayan, the rabbi, about going somewhere else. In the Bes HaMedrash here, there is nothing to do, nobody to study with, nobody to ask how and where and in which book. And he advises me to go to the yeshiva at Makov. He will give me a letter to Reb Chaim, the Rosh, and ask him to befriend me." When Taube heard that her son was about to leave her, she experienced a great shock. But the words Dayan, Rosh HaYeshiva, Mekarev Sein, and the other high-sounding bits of Hebrew which she did not understand, overawed her, and she felt she must control herself. Besides, the words held some comfort for her. Yitzchok was holding counsel with her, his mother. "Of course, if the Dayan thinks so," she answered piously. "Yes," Yitzchok continued, "there one can hear lectures with all the commentaries. Reb Chaim, the author of the book Ba'or HaTorah, Light of the Torah, is a well-known scholar, and there one has a chance of getting to be something decent." His words entirely reassured her. She felt a certain happiness and exultation, because he was her child, because she was the mother of such a child, such a son, and because, were it not for her, Yitzchok would not be there at all. At the same time, her heart pained her, and she grew sad. Presently she remembered her husband, and burst out crying. "If only he had lived, if only he could have had this consolation," she sobbed. Yitzchok minded his book. That night Taube could not sleep, for at the thought of Yitzchok's departure her heart ached within her, and she dreamt, as she lay in bed, that some great rabbis with tall fur caps and long payas came in and took her Yitzchok away from her. Her Yitzchok was wearing a strimmel and payas like theirs, and he held a large book, and he went far away with the rabbis. And she stood and gazed after him, not knowing should she rejoice or weep. Next morning she woke late. Yitzchok had already gone to his studies. She hastened to dress the children and hurried to the marketplace. At her stall she fell a-thinking, and fancied she was sitting beside her son, who was a rabbi in a large town. There he sits, in shoes and socks, a great fur strimmel on his head, and looks into a huge book. She sits at his right hand, knitting a sock. The door opens, and there appears Yenter, carrying a dish, to ask a ritual question of Taube's son. A customer disturbed her sweet dream. After this, Taube sat up whole nights at the table by the light of the smoky lamp, rearranging and mending Yitzchok's shirts for the journey. She recalled with every stitch that she was sewing for Yitzchok, who was going to the yeshiva, to sit and study, and who, every Friday, would put on a shirt prepared for him by his mother. Yitzchok sat, as always, on the other side of the table, gazing into a book. His mother would have liked to speak to him, but she did not know what to say. Taube and Yitzchokel were up before daylight. Yitzchokel kissed his little brothers in their sleep and said to his little sleeping sisters, "Remain in health." One sister woke and began to cry, saying she wanted to go with him. The mother embraced and quieted her softly. Then she and Yitzchokel left the room, carrying his box between them. The street was still fast asleep. The shops were still closed. Behind the church belfry the morning star shone coldly forth onto the cold morning dew on the roofs, and there was silence over all, except in the marketplace, where there stood a peasant's cart laden with fruit. It was surrounded by women, and Yente's voice was heard from afar. 5 gulden and 10 groschen, and I'll take the lot. And Taube, carrying Yitzchokel's box behind him, walked thus through the marketplace, and catching sight of Yente, she looked at her with pride. They came out behind the town onto the high road, and waited for an opportunity to come by on its way to Lenschitz, whence Yitzchokel was to proceed to Kutno. The sky was grey and cold, and mingled in the distance with the dingy mist rising from the fields, and the road, silent and deserted, ran away out of sight. They sat down beside the barrier and waited for the opportunity. The mother scraped together a few 20-kopek pieces out of her pocket and put them into his bosom, twisted up in his shirt. Presently a cart came by, crowded with passengers. She secured a seat for Yitzchokel for 40 groschen and hoisted the box onto the cart. "Geh gesinnt, don't forget your mother," she cried in tears. Yitzchokel was silent. She wanted to kiss her child, but she knew it was not the thing for a grown-up boy to be kissed, so she refrained. Yitzchokel mounted the cart. The passengers made room for him among them. "Remain in health, mother," he called out as the cart set off. "Geh gesinnt, my child. Sit and study, and don't forget your mother," she cried after him. The cart moved further and further, till it was climbing the hill in the distance. Taube still stood and followed it with her gaze, and not till it was lost to view in the dust did she turn and walk back to the town. She took a road that should lead her past the cemetery. There was a rather low plank fence round it, and the gravestones were all to be seen looking up to heaven. Taube went and hitched herself onto the fence and put her head over into the field, looking for something among the tombs, and when her eyes had discovered a familiar little tombstone, she shook her head. "Lezer, Lezer, your son has driven away to the yeshiva to study Torah." Then she remembered the market, where Yente must by now have bought up the whole cartload of fruit. There would be nothing left for her, and she hurried into the town. She walked at a great pace and felt very pleased with herself. She was conscious of having done a great thing, and this dissipated her annoyance at the thought of Yente acquiring all the fruit. 2 weeks later she got a letter from Yitzchokel, and, not being able to read it herself, she took it to Reb Yochanan, the teacher, that he might read it for her. Reb Yochanan put on his glasses, cleared his throat thoroughly, and began to read. "Le'imi ahuvosi hazeno." "What is the translation?" asked Taube. "It is the way to address a mother," explained Reb Yochanan, and continued. Tauber's face had brightened, and she put her apron to her eyes and wept for joy. The reader observed this and read on.
"What is the translation, Reb Yochanan?" the woman kept asking.
"Never mind, it's not for you. You wouldn't understand. It's an exposition of a passage in the Gemara." She was silent. The Hebrew words awed her, and she listened respectfully to the end. "I salute Imi Ahuvosi and Achoisei, Sarah and Golda and Ochi Yaakov. Tell him to study diligently. I have all my days and I sleep at Reb Chaim's," gave out Reb Yochanan suddenly in Yiddish. Tauber contented herself with these few words, took back the letter, put it into her pocket, and went back to her stall with great joy. "This evening," she thought, "I will show it to the Dayan, and let him read it too." And no sooner had she got home, cooked the dinner and fed the children, than she was off with the letter to the Dayan. She entered the room, saw the tall bookcases filled with books covering the walls, and a man with a white beard sitting at the end of the table reading. "What is it? A ritual question?" asked the Dayan from his place.
"No."
"What then?"
"A letter from my Yitzchokel."
The Dayan rose, came up and looked at her, took the letter, and began to read it silently to himself. "Well done. Excellent. Good. The little fellow knows what he is saying," said the Dayan more to himself than to her. Tears streamed from Tauber's eyes. If only he had lived! If only he had lived! "Shechitas chutz, Rambam, Tosafos is right," went on the Dayan.
"Herr Yitzchokel, Tauber the market woman's son," she thought proudly.
"Take the letter," said the Dayan at last. "I've read it all the way through."
"Well, and what?"
asked the woman. "What? What do you want then?"
"What does it say?" she asked in a low voice.
"There's nothing in it for you. You wouldn't understand," replied the Dayan with a smile. Yitzchokel continued to write home. The Yiddish words were fewer every time, often only a greeting to his mother, and she came to Reb Yochanan, and he read her the Yiddish phrases with which she had to be satisfied.
"The Hebrew words are for the Dayan," she said to herself.
But one day, "There is nothing in the letter for you," said Reb Yochanan.
"What do you mean?"
"Nothing," he said shortly.
"Read me at least what there is."
"But it is all Hebrew, Torah. You wouldn't understand."
"Very well then, I won't understand."
"Go in health and don't drive me distracted." Tauber left him and resolved to go that evening to the Dayan.
"Rabbi, excuse me, translate this into Yiddish," she said, handing him the letter. The Dayan took the letter and read it. "Nothing there for you," he said. "Rabbi," said Tauber shyly, "excuse me, translate the Hebrew for me."
"But it is Torah, an exposition of a passage in the Torah. You won't understand."
"Well, if you would only read the letter in Hebrew, but aloud, so that I may hear what he says."
"You won't understand one word. It's Hebrew," persisted the Dayan with a smile.
"Well, I won't understand, that's all," said the woman. "But it's my child's Torah, my child's."
The Dayan reflected a while, then he began to read aloud. Presently, however, he glanced at Taube and remembered that he was expounding the Torah to a woman, and he felt thankful no one had heard him. "Take the letter, there is nothing in it for you," he said compassionately, and sat down again in his place.
"But it is my child's Torah, my Yitzchakel's letter. Why mayn't I hear it? What does it matter if I don't understand? It is my own child."
The Dayan turned coldly away. When Taube reached home after this interview, she sat down at the table, took down the lamp from the wall, and looked silently at the letter by its smoky light. She kissed the letter, but then it occurred to her that she was defiling it with her lips, she, a sinful woman. She rose, took her husband's prayer book from the bookshelf, and lay the letter between its leaves. Then, with trembling lips, she kissed the covers of the book, and placed it once more in the bookcase. End of A Scholar's Mother by Sholem Asch. Section 46 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 46. The Sinner by Shalom Asch. So that you should not suspect me of taking his part, I will write a short preface to my story. It is written, "A man never so much as moves his finger, but it has been so decreed from above. And whatever a man does, he fulfills God's will. Even animals and birds, lahavdil, carry out God's wishes. Whenever a bird flies, it fulfills a precept, because God, blessed is He, formed it to fly. And an ox the same when it lows, and even a dog when it barks. All praise God with their voices, and sing hymns to Him, each after his manner. And even the wicked who transgresses fulfills God's will in spite of himself. Because, why? Do you suppose he takes pleasure in transgressing? Isn't he certain to repent? Well then, he is just carrying out the will of heaven. And even the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination himself, why, every time he is sent to persuade a Jew to sin, he weeps and sighs. Woe is me, that I should be sent on such an errand." After this little preface, I will tell you the story itself. Formerly, before the thing happened, he was called Reb Avraham. But afterwards they ceased calling him by his name, and simply said, "the sinner." Reb Avraham was looked up to and respected by the whole town, a God-fearing Jew, beloved and honoured by all, and mothers wished they might have children like him. He sat the whole day in the Beth HaMedrash and learned. Not that he was a great scholar, but he was a pious, scrupulously observant Jew who followed the straight and beaten road. A man without any pride. He used to recite the prayers in shul together with strangers by the door, and quite quietly, without any shouting, or, as one might say, any special enthusiasm. His prayer rose to heaven, the barred gates opening before it till it entered, and was taken up into the throne of glory. This prayer of his did not become a diamond there, dazzling the eye, but a softly glistening pearl. And how, you ask, did he come to be called the sinner? On this wise. You must know that everyone, even those who were hardest on him after the affair, acknowledged that he was a great lover of Israel. And I will add that his sin and, heaven defend us, his coming to such a fall, all proceeded from his being such a lover of Israel, such a patriot. And it was just the simple Jew, the very common folk, that he loved. He used to say, a Jew who is a driver, for instance, and busy all week with his horses and cart, and soaked in materialism for 6 days at a stretch, so that he only just manages to get to his prayers, when he comes home on Sabbath and sits down to table, and the bed is made, and the candles burning, and his wife and children all round him, and they sing hymns together, well, the driver dozing off over his siddur and forgetting to say grace. I tell you, said Reb Avraham, the divine presence rests on his house and rejoices and says, happy am I that I chose me out of this people. For such a Jew keeps Sabbath, rests himself, and his horse rests, keeps Sabbath likewise, stands in the stable, and is also conscious that it is the holy Sabbath. And when the driver rises from his sleep, he leads the animal out to pasture, waters it, and they all go for a walk with it in the meadow. And this walk of theirs is more acceptable to God, blessed be He, than repeating Barki nafshi es Adonai, bless the Lord, O my soul. It may be this was because he himself was of humble origin. He had lived till he was 13 with his father, a farmer, in an out-of-the-way village, and ignorant even of his letters. True, his father had taken a youth into the house to teach him Hebrew, but Reb Avraham, as a boy, was very wild, wouldn't mind his book, and ran all day after the oxen and horses. He used to lie out in the meadow, hidden in the long grasses. Near him the horses with their heads down pulling at the grass, and the view stretched far, far away into the endless distance, and above him spread the wide sky, through which the clouds made their way, and the green, juicy earth seemed to look up at it and say, look, sky, and see how cheerfully I try to obey God's behest, to make the world green with grass. And the sky made answer, see, earth, how I try to fulfill God's command by spreading myself far and wide. And the few trees scattered over the fields were like witnesses to their friendly agreement. And little Avraham lay and rejoiced in the goodness and all the work of God. Suddenly, as though he had received a revelation from heaven, he went home and asked the youth who was his teacher, what blessing should one recite on feeling happy at the sight of the world? The youth laughed and said, you stupid boy, one says a blessing over bread and water, but as to saying one over this world, who ever heard of such a thing? Avraham wondered. The world is beautiful, the sky so pretty, the earth so sweet and soft, everything is so delightful to look at, and one says no bracha over it all. At 13 he had left the village and come to the town. There, in the study house, he saw the Rosh HaYeshiva sitting at one end of the table, and around it the scholars, all reciting in fervent, appealing tones that went to his heart. The boy began to cry, whereupon the Rosh HaYeshiva turned and saw a little boy with a torn hat crying, and his hair coming out through the holes, and his boots slung over his shoulder, like a peasant lad, fresh from the road. The scholars laughed, but the Rosh asked him what he wanted. "To learn," he answered in a low, pleading voice. The Rosh HaYeshiva had compassion on him and took him as a pupil. Avraham applied himself earnestly to the Torah, and in a few days could read Hebrew and follow the prayers without help. And the way he prayed was a treat to watch. You should have seen him. He just stood and talked as one person talks to another, quietly and affectionately, without any tricks of manner. Once the Rosh saw him praying, and said before his whole academy, "I can learn better than he, but when it comes to praying, I don't reach to his ankles." And that is what he said. So Reb Avraham lived there till he was grown up, and married the daughter of a simple tailor. Indeed, he learned tailoring himself, and lived by his 10 fingers. By day he sat and sewed with an open prayer book before him, and recited portions of the Psalms to himself. After dark he went to the study house, so quietly that no one noticed him, and passed half the night over the Talmud. Once some strangers came to town, and spent the night in the study house behind the stove. Suddenly they heard a thin, sweet voice that was like a tune in itself. They started up and saw him at his book. The small lamp hanging by a cord poured a dim light upon him where he sat, while the walls remained in shadow. He studied with ardour, with enthusiasm, only his enthusiasm was not for beholders. It was all within. He swayed slowly to and fro, and his shadow swayed with him, and he softly chanted the Gemara. By degrees his voice rose, his face kindled, and his eyes began to glow. One could see that his very soul was resolving itself into his chanting. The divine presence hovered over him, and he drank in its sweetness. And in the middle of his reading, he got up and walked about the room, repeating in a trembling whisper, "Ribono shel Olam, Lord of the world." Then his voice grew as suddenly calm, and he stood still, as though he had dozed off where he stood, for pure delight. The lamp grew dim, and still he stood, and never moved. Awe fell on the travellers behind the stove, and they cried out. He started and approached them, and they had to close their eyes against the brightness of his face, the light that shone out of his eyes. And he stood there quite quietly and simply, and asked in a gentle voice why they had called out. Were they cold? And he took off his cloak and spread it over them. Next morning the travellers told all this, and declared that no sooner had the cloak touched them than they had fallen asleep, and they had seen and heard nothing more that night. After this, when the whole town had got wind of it, and they found out who it was that night in the house of study, the people began to believe that he was a tzaddik, and they came to him with petitions, as Chassidim to their Rebbes, asking him to pray for their health and other wants. And when they brought him such a petition, he would smile and say, "Believe me, a little boy who says a brocha over a piece of bread which his mother has given him, he can help you more than 20 such as I." Of course, his words made no impression, except that they brought him more petitions than ever, upon which he said, "You insist on a man of flesh and blood such as I being your advocate with
God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, hear a parable. To what shall we liken the thing? To the light of the sun and the light of a small lamp. You can rejoice in the sunlight as much as you please, and no one can take your joy from you. The poorest and most humble may revive himself with it, so long as his eyes can behold it. And even though a man should sit, which God forbid, in a dungeon with closed windows, a reflection will make its way in through the chinks, and he shall rejoice in the brightness. But with the poor light of a lamp it is otherwise. A rich man buys a quantity of lamps and illuminates his house, while a poor man sits in darkness. God, Baruch Hu, is the great light that shines for the whole world, reviving and refreshing all his works. The whole world is full of his mercy, and his compassion is over all his creatures. Believe me, you have no need of an advocate with him. God is your Father, and you are his dear children. How should a child need an advocate with his father? The ordinary folk heard and were silent, but our people, the Hasidim, were displeased. And I'll tell you another thing. I was the first to mention it to the Rabbi, long life to him, and he, as is well known, commanded Reb Avraham to his presence. So we set to work to persuade Reb Avraham and talk to him till he had to go with us. The journey lasted 4 days. I remember one night the moon was wandering in a blue ocean of sky that spread ever so far till it mingled with a cloud, and she looked at us pitifully and appealingly, as though to ask us if we knew which way she ought to go, to the right or to the left, and presently the cloud came upon her, and she began struggling to get out of it. And a minute or two later she was free again and smiling at us. Then a little breeze came and stroked our faces, and we looked round to the 4 sides of the world, and it seemed as if the whole world were wrapped in a tallis woven of mercy, and we fell into a slight melancholy, a quiet sadness, but so sweet and pleasant. It felt like on a Sabbath, at twilight, at the 3rd meal. Suddenly Reb Avraham exclaimed, "Jews, have you said the blessings on the appearance of the new moon?" We turned toward the moon, laid down our bundles, washed our hands in the little stream that ran by the roadside, and repeated the brachas for the new moon. He stood looking into the sky, his lips scarcely moving, as was his wont. "Sholem Alechem," he said, turning to me, and his voice quivered like a violin, and his eyes called to peace and unity. Then an awe of Reb Avraham came over me for the first time, and when we had finished sanctifying the moon, our melancholy left us, and we prepared to continue our way. But still he stood and gazed heavenward, sighing, "Ribbono shel olam, Lord of the universe, how beautiful is the world which thou hast made by thy goodness and great mercy, and these are over all thy creatures. They all love thee and are glad in thee, and thou art glad in them, and the whole world is full of thy glory." I glanced up at the moon, and it seemed that she was still looking at me and saying, "I'm lost. Which way am I to go?" We arrived Friday afternoon, and had time enough to go to the mikveh and to greet the Rebbe. He, long life to him, was seated in the reception room beside a table, his long lashes
low over his eyes, leaning on his left hand while he greeted incomers with his right. We went up to him one at a time, shook hands and said Sholem Alechem, and he, long life to him, said nothing to us. Reb Avraham also went up to him and held out his hand. A change came over the Rebbe. He raised his eyelids with his fingers and looked at Reb Avraham for some time in silence. And Reb Avraham looked at the Rebbe and was silent too. The Hasidim were offended by such impertinence. That evening we assembled in the Rebbe's study house to usher in the Sabbath. It was tightly packed with Jews, one pushing the other or seizing hold of his girdle. Only beside the ark was there a free space left, a semicircle, in the middle of which stood the Rebbe, who prayed. But Reb Avraham stood by the door among the poor guests and prayed after his fashion. "To Kiddush," called the Shamus. The Rebbe's wife, daughters and daughters-in-law now appeared, and their jewellery, their precious stones and their pearls sparkled and shone. The Rebbe stood and repeated the Kiddush. He was slightly bent, and his grey beard swept his breast. His eyes were screened by his lashes, and he recited the Kiddush in a loud voice, giving to every word a peculiar inflection, to every sign an expression of its own. "To table!" was called out next. At the head of the table sat the Rebbe, sons and sons-in-law to the left, relations to the right of him, then the principal aged Jews, then the rich. The people stood round about. The Rebbe ate and began to serve out the leavings, to his sons and sons-in-law first, and to the rest of those sitting at the table after. Then there was silence. The Rebbe began to expound the Torah. The portion of the week was Bamidbar, chapter 8, and the Rebbe began: "When a man's soul is on a low level, enveloped, heaven defend us, in uncleanness, and the divine spark within the soul wishes to rise to a higher level and cannot do so alone, but must needs be helped, it is a mitzvah to help her, to raise her, and this mitzvah is especially incumbent on the priest. This is the meaning of the 7 lamps shall give light over against the candlestick, by which is meant the Holy Torah. The priest must bring the Jew's heart near the Torah. In this way he is able to raise it. And who is the priest? The righteous in his generation, because since the temple was destroyed, the saint must be a priest. For thus is the command from above, that he shall be the priest." "Avraham!" the Rebbe called suddenly. "Avraham, come here, I am calling you." The other went up to him. "Avraham, did you understand? Did you make out the meaning of what I said?" "Your silence," the Rebbe went on, "is an acknowledgment. I must raise you, even though it be against my will and against your will." There was dead stillness in the room, people waiting to hear what would come next. "You are silent?" asked the Rebbe, now a little sternly. "You want to be a raiser of souls? Have you, bless and preserve us, bought the Almighty for yourself? Do you think that a Jew can approach nearer to God, blessed be He, through you? That you are the handle of the pestle and the rest of the Jews nowhere? God's grace is everywhere, whichever way we turn. Every time we move a limb, we feel God. Everyone must seek Him in his own heart, because there It is that he has caused the divine presence to rest. Everywhere and always can the Jew draw near to God." Thus answered Reb Avraham. But our people, the Rebbe's followers, shut his mouth before he had made an end, and had the Rebbe not held them back, they would have torn him to pieces on the spot. "Leave him alone," he commanded the Hasidim. And to Reb Avraham he said, "Avraham, you have sinned." And from that day forward he was called the sinner, and was shut out from everywhere. The Hasidim kept their eye on him, and persecuted him, and he was not even allowed to pray in the Bes HaMedrash. And I'll tell you what I think. A wicked man, even when he acts according to his wickedness, fulfills God's command. And who knows? Perhaps they were both right. End of The Sinner by Sholem Asch. Section 47 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 47. Isaac Dov Berkowitz, born 1885 in Slutsk, government of Minsk, Lithuania, White Russia, was in America for a short time in 1908. Contributor to Die Zukunft, co-editor of Ha'olam, Vilna, Hebrew and Yiddish writer, collected works, Yiddish, Gesammelte Schriften, Warsaw, 1910, Hebrew, Siparim, Krakow, 1910. Country Folk by Isaac Dov Berkowitz. Fivka was a wild little villager, about 7 years old, who had tumbled up from babyhood among Gentile urchins, the only Jewish boy in the place, just as his father, Matis, the Kozlov smith, was the only Jewish householder there. Fivka had hardly ever met or even seen anyone but the people of Kozlov and their children. Had it not been for his black eyes, with their moody, persistent gaze from beneath the shade of a deep, worn-out leather cap, it would have puzzled anyone to make out his parentage, to know whence that torn and battered face, that red scar across the top lip, those large, black, flat, unchildlike feet. But the eyes explained everything. His mother's eyes. Fivka spent the whole summer with the village urchins in the neighbouring wood, picking mushrooms, climbing the trees, driving wood pigeons off their high nests, or wading knee-deep in the shallow bog outside to seek the black, slippery bogworms. Or else he found himself out in the fields, jumping about on the top of a load of hay under a hot sky, and shouting to his companions till he was bathed in perspiration. At other times he gathered himself away into a dark, cool barn, scrambled at the peril of his life along a round beam under the roof, crunched dried pears, saw how the sun sprinkled the darkness with 1,000 sparks, and thought. He could always think about Mikita, the son of the village elder, who had almost risen to be a conductor on the railway train, and who came from a long way off to visit his father, brass buttons to his coat, and a purse full of silver roubles, and piped to the village girls of an evening on the most cunning kind of whistle. It often had happened that Fivka could not be found, and did not even come home to bed, but his parents troubled precious little about him, seeing that he was growing up a wild, dissolute boy, and the pleasure of heaven rested on his head. Feivke was not a timid child, but there were two things he was afraid of: God and davening. Feivke had never, to the best of his recollection, seen God, but he often heard his name. They threatened him with it, glanced up at the ceiling, and sighed, and this embittered somewhat his sweet, free days. He felt that the older he grew, the sooner he would have to present himself before this terrifying, stern and unfamiliar God, who was hidden somewhere, whether near or far he could not tell. One day Feivke all but ran a danger. It was early on a winter's morning. There was a cold, wild wind blowing outside, and indoors there was a black stranger Jew in a thick sheepskin, breaking open the tin charity boxes. The smith's wife served the stranger with hot potatoes and sour milk, whereupon the stranger piously closed his eyes and, having reopened them, caught sight of Feivke through the white steam rising from the dish of potatoes. Feivke huddled in a corner and beckoned him nearer. "Have you begun to learn, little boy?" he questioned, and took his cheek between two pale, cold fingers, which sent a whiff of snuff up Feivke's nose. His mother, standing by the stove, reddened, and made some inaudible answer. The black stranger threw up his eyes and slowly shook his head inside the wide sheepskin collar. This shaking to and fro of his head boded no good, and Feivke grew strangely cold inside. Then he grew hot all over, and for several nights after, thousands of long, cold, pale fingers pursued and pinched him in his dreams. They had never yet taught him to recite his prayers. Kozlov was a lonely village, far from any Jewish settlement. Every Sabbath morning Feivke, snug in bed, watched his father put on a mended black cloak, wrap himself in the tallis, shut his eyes, take on a bleating voice, and, turning to the wall, commence a series of bows. Feivke felt that his father was bowing before God, and this frightened him. He thought it a very rash proceeding. Feivke, in his father's place, would sooner have had nothing to do with God. He spent most of the time while his father was at his prayers cowering under the coverlet, and only crept out when he heard his mother busy with plates and spoons, and the pungent smell of chopped radishes and onions penetrated to the bedroom. Winters and summers passed, and Feivke grew to be 7 years old, just such a Feivke as we have described. And the last summer passed and gave way to autumn. That autumn the smith's wife was brought to bed of a 7th child, and before she was about again, the cold, damp days were upon them, with the misty mornings when a fish shivers in the water. And the days of her confinement were mingled for the lovely village Jewess with the solemn days of that year into a hard, dreary time. She went slowly about the house, as if in a fog, without help or hope, and silent as a shadow. That year they all led a dismal life. The elder children, girls, went out to service in the neighbouring towns, to make their own way among strangers. The peasants had become sharper and worse than formerly, and the smith's strength was not what it had been. So his wife resolved to send the 2 men of the family, Matzis and Feivke, to a minyan this Yom Kippur. Maybe if 2 went, God would not be able to resist them, and would soften his heart. One morning, therefore, Matzis the smith washed, donned his mended Sabbath cloak, went to the window and blinked through it with his red and swollen eyes. It was the eve of the Day of Atonement. The room was well warmed, and there was a smell of freshly stewed carrots. The smith's wife went out to seek Feivke through the village, and brought him home, dishevelled and distracted, and all of a glow. She had torn him away from an early morning of excitement and delight, such as could never be again. Mikita, the son of the village elder, had put his father's brown colt into harness for the first time. The whole contingent of village boys had been present to watch the fiery young animal twisting between the shafts, drawing loud breaths into its dilated and quivering nostrils, looking wildly at the surrounding boys and stamping impatiently as though it would have liked to plough away the earth from under its feet. And suddenly it had given a bound and started careering through the village with the cart behind it. There was a glorious noise and commotion. Feivke was foremost among those who, in a cloud of dust and at the peril of their life, had dashed to seize the colt by the reins. His mother washed him, looked him over from the low-set leather hat down to his great black feet, stuffed a packet of food into his hands, and said, "Go and be a good and devout boy, and God will forgive you." She stood on the threshold of the house and looked after her 2 men, starting for a distant minyan. The bearing of 7 children had aged and weakened the once hard, obstinate woman, and left standing alone in the doorway, watching her poor, barefoot, perverse-natured boy on his way to present himself for the first time before God, she broke down by the mezuzah and wept. Silently, step by step, Feivke followed his father between the desolate stubble fields. It was a good 10 miles' walk to the large village where the minyan assembled, and the fear and the wonder in Feivke's heart increased all the way. He did not yet quite understand whither he was being taken, and what was to be done with him there, and the impetus of the brown colt's career through the village had not as yet subsided in his head. Why had father put on his black mended coat? Why had he brought a tallis with him and a white shirt-like garment? There was certainly some hour of calamity and terror ahead. Something was preparing which had never happened before. They went by the great Kozlov wood, wherein every tree stood silent and sad for its faded and fallen leaves. Feivke dropped behind his father and stepped aside into the wood. He wondered, should he run away and hide in the wood? He would willingly stay there for the rest of his life. He would foregather with Nasta, the barrel-maker's son, he of the knocked-out eye. They would roast potatoes out in the wood, and, now and again, stolen-wise, milk the village cows for their repast. Let them beat him as much as they pleased, let them kill him on the spot, nothing should induce him to leave the wood again. But no. As Feivke walked along under the silent trees and through the fallen leaves, and perceived that the whole wood was filled through and through with a soft, clear light, and heard the rustle of the leaves beneath his step, a strange terror took hold of him. The wood had grown so sparse, the trees so discoloured, and he should have to remain in the stillness alone, and roam about in the winter wind. Matzes, the smith, had stopped, wondering, and was blinking around with his sick eyes. "Feivke, where are you?" Feivke appeared out of the wood. "Feivke, today you must not go into the wood. Today God may yet... Today you must be a good boy," said the smith, repeating his wife's words as they came to his mind, "and you must say Amen." Feivke hung his head and looked at his great bare black feet.
But if I don't know how, he said sullenly. It's no great thing to say Amen, his father replied encouragingly. When you hear the other people say it, you can say it too. Everyone must say Amen. Then God will forgive them, he added, recalling again his wife and her admonitions. Feivke was silent, and once more followed his father step by step. What will they ask him, and what is he to answer? It seemed to him now that they were going right over away yonder, where the pale, scarcely tinted sky touched the earth. There, on a hill, sits a great old God in a large sheepskin cloak. Everyone goes up to him, and he asks them questions, which they have to answer, and he shakes his head to and fro inside the sheepskin collar. And what is he, a wild, ignorant little boy, to answer this great old God? Feivke had committed a great many transgressions concerning which his mother was constantly admonishing him, but now he was thinking only of two great transgressions committed recently, of which his mother knew nothing. One with regard to Anishka, the beggar. Anishka was known to the village as far back as it could remember as an old blind beggar who went the round of the villages feeling his way with a long stick. And one day Feivke and another lad played him a trick. They placed a ladder in his way, and Anishka stumbled and fell, hurting his nose. Some peasants came up and caught Feivke. Anishka sat in the middle of the road with blood on his face, wept bitterly, and declared that God would not forget his blood that had been spilt. The peasants had given little Zydek a sound thrashing, but Feivke felt now as if that would not count. God would certainly remember the spilling of Anishka's blood. Feivke's second hidden transgression had been committed outside the village, among the graves of the peasants. A whole troop of boys, Feivke in their midst, had gone pigeon hunting, aiming at the pigeons with stones, and a stone of Feivke's had hit the naked figure on the cross that stood there among the graves. The Gentile boys had started and taken fright, and those among them who were Feivke's good friends told him he had actually hit the Son of God, and that the thing would have consequences. It was one for which people had their heads cut off. These two great transgressions now stood before him, and his heart warned him that the hour had come when he would be called to account for what he had done to Anishka and to God's Son. Only he did not know what answer he could make. By the time they came near the windmill belonging to the large strange village, the sun had begun to set. The village river, with trees beside it, were visible a long way off, and crossing the river, a long, high bridge. "The minyan is there," and Mattes pointed his finger at the thatched roofs shining in the sunset. Feivke looked down from the bridge into the deep black water that lay smooth and still in the shadow of the trees. The bridge was high and the water deep. Feivke felt sick at heart, and his mouth was dry. "But Tati, I won't be able to answer," he let out in despair. "What, not Amen? You little silly, that is no great matter. Where is the difficulty? One just ups and answers," said his father gently. But Feivke heard that the while his father was trying to quieten him, his own voice trembled.
At the other end of the bridge there appeared the great inn with the covered terrace, and in front of the building were moving groups of Jews in holiday garb, with red handkerchiefs in their hands, women in yellow silk headkerchiefs, and boys in new clothes holding small prayer books. Feivke remained obstinately outside the crowd and hung about the stable, his black eyes staring defiantly from beneath the worn-out leather cap. But he was not left alone long, for soon there came to him a smart yellow-haired boy with restless little light-coloured eyes and a face like a chicken's, covered with freckles. This little boy took a little bottle with some essence in it out of his pocket, gave it a twist and a flourish in the air, and suddenly applied it to Feivke's nose, so that the strong waters spurted into his nostril. Then he asked, "To whom do you belong?" Feivke blew the water out of his nose and turned his head away in silence.
"Listen, turkey, lazy dog, what are you doing there? Have you said mincha?" "No." "Is the Jew in a torn cloak there your father?" "Yes." "Tati." The yellow-haired boy took Feivke by the sleeve. "Come along, and you'll see what they do to your father." Inside the room into which Feivke was dragged by his new friend, it was hot, and there was a curious, unfamiliar sound. Feivke grew dizzy. He saw Jews bowing and bending along the wall and beating their breasts. Now they said something, and now they wept in an odd way. People coughed and spat sobbingly, and blew their noses with their red handkerchiefs. Chairs and stiff benches creaked, while a continuous clatter of plates and spoons came through the wall. In a corner beside a heap of hay, Feivke saw his father where he stood, looking all around him, blinking shamefacedly and innocently with his weak red eyes. Round him was a lively circle of little boys, whispering with one another in evident expectation. "That is his boy with the lip," said the chicken-faced, presenting Feivke. At the same moment a young man came up to Matzes. He wore a white collar without a tie, and with a pointed brass stud. This young man held a whip, which he brandished in the air like a rider about to mount his horse. "Well, Reb Smith?" Am I suppose I am to lie down?" asked Matzes subserviently, still smiling round in the same shy yet confiding manner. "Be so good as to lie down." The young man gave a mischievous look at the boys, and made a gesture in the air with the whip. Matzes began to unbutton his cloak, and slowly and cautiously let himself down onto the hay, whereupon the young man applied the whip with might and main, and his whole face shone. "1, 2, 3, go on, Rebbe, go on," urged the boys, and there were shouts of laughter. Feivke looked on in amaze. He wanted to go and take his father by the sleeve, make him get up and escape. But just then Matzes raised himself to a sitting posture and began to rub his eyes with the same shy smile. "Now, Rebbe, this one," said the yellow-haired boy, and the yellow-haired boy began to drag Feivke toward the hay. The others assisted. Feivke got very red, and silently tried to tear himself out of the boy's hands, making for the door, but the other kept his hold. In the doorway Feivke glared at him with his obstinate black eyes and said, "I'll knock your teeth out." "Mine? You booby, you lazy thing, this is our house. Do you know, on New Year's Eve I went with my grandfather to the town. I shall call LibriVox. He'll give you something to remember him by." And LibriVox was not long in joining them. He was the inn driver, a stout youth of 15 in a peasant smock with a collar stitched in red, otherwise in full array, with linen socks and a handsome bottle of strong waters against faintness in his hands.
To judge by the size of the bottle, his sturdy looks belied a particularly delicate constitution. He pushed towards Feivke with one shoulder in no friendly fashion, and looked at him with one eye while he winked with the other at the freckled grandson of the host. "Who is the beauty?" "How should I know? A thief, most likely. The Kozlov Smith's boy. He threatened to knock out my teeth." "So, so, dear brother mine," sang out Leibrutz with a cold sneer, and passed his 5 fingers across Feivke's nose. "We must rub a little horseradish under his eyes, and he'll weep like a beaver. Listen, you Kozlov urchin, you just keep your hands in your pockets, because Leibrutz is here. Do you know Leibrutz? Lucky for you that I have a Jewish heart. Today is Yom Kippur." But the chicken-faced boy was not pacified. "Did you ever see such a lip? Then he comes to our house and wants to fight us." The whole lot of boys now encircled Feivke with teasing and laughter, and he stood barefooted in their midst, looking at none of them, and reminding one of a little wild animal caught and tormented. It grew dark, and quantities of soul lights were set burning down the long tables of the inn. The large building was packed with red-faced, perspiring Jews in long white robes and talissim. The Vidui was already in course of fervent recital. There was a great rocking and swaying over the prayer books, and a loud noise in the ears, everyone present trying to make himself heard above the rest. Village Jews are simple and ignorant. They know nothing of silent prayer and whispering with the lips. They are deprived of prayer in common a year at a time, and are distant from the Lord of all, and when the awful day comes, they want to take him by storm, by violence. The noisiest of all was the prayer leader himself, the young man with the white collar and no tie. He was from town, and wished to convince the country folk that he was an adept at his profession and to be relied on. Feivke stood in the stifling room utterly confounded. The prayers and the wailful chanting passed over his head like waves. His heart was straitened. Red sparks whirled before his eyes. He was in a state of continual apprehension. He saw a snow-white old Jew come out of a corner with a Sefer Torah wrapped in a white velvet, gold-embroidered cover. How the gold sparkled and twinkled and reflected itself in the illuminated beard of the old man. Feivke thought the moment had come, but he saw it all as through a mist, a long way off, to the sound of the wailful chanting, and, as in a mist, the scroll and the old man vanished together. Feivke's face and body were flushed with heat, his knees shook, and at the same time his hands and feet were cold as ice. Once, while Feivke was standing by the table facing the bright flames of the soul lights, a dizziness came over him, and he closed his eyes. Thousands of little bells seemed to ring in his ears. Then someone gave a loud thump on the table, and there was silence all around. Feivke started and opened his eyes. The sudden stillness frightened him, and he wanted to move away from the table, but he was walled in by men in white robes who had begun rocking and swaying anew. One of them pushed a prayer book towards him with great black letters, which hopped and fluttered to Feivke's eyes like so many little black birds. He shook visibly, and the men looked at him in silence. He remained for some time squeezed against the prayer book, hemmed in by the tall, strange men in robes, shockling over his head. A cold perspiration broke out over him, and when at last he freed himself, he felt very tired and weak. Having found his way to a corner close to his father, he fell asleep on the floor. There he had a strange dream. He dreamt that he was a tree, growing like any other tree in a wood, and that he saw Anishka coming out with blood on his face, in one hand his long stick, and in the other a stone, and Feivke recognized the stone with which he had hit the crucifix, and Anishka kept turning his head and making signs to someone with his long stick, calling out to him that here was Feivke. Feivke looked hard, and there in the depths of the wood was God himself, white all over, like freshly fallen snow. And God suddenly grew ever so tall and looked down at Feivke. Feivke felt God looking at him, but he could not see God because there was a mist before his eyes. And Anishka came nearer and nearer with the stone in his hand. Feivke shook, and cold perspiration oozed out all over him. He wanted to run away, but he seemed to be growing there like a tree, like all the other trees of the wood. Feivke awoke on the floor, amid sleeping men, and the first thing he saw was a tall, barefoot person, all in white, standing over the sleepers with something in his hand. This tall, white figure sank slowly onto its knees, and, bending silently over Matzes the smith, who lay snoring with the rest, it deliberately put a bottle to his nose. Matzes gave a squeal and sat up hastily. "Ha! Who is it?" he asked in alarm. It was the young man from town, the prayer leader, the chazan with a bottle of strong-smelling salts. "It is I," he said with a dégagé air, and smiled. "Never mind, it will do you good. You are fasting, and there is an express law in the Chayei Odom on the subject." "But why me?" complained Matzes, blinking at him reproachfully. "What have I done to you?" Day was about to dawn. The air in the room had cooled down. The soul lights were still playing in the dark, dewy window panes. A few of the men bedded in the hay on the floor were waking up. Feivke stood in the middle of the room with staring eyes. The young man with the smelling bottle came up to him with a lively air. "Oh, you little object, what are you staring at me for? Do you want a sniff? There then, sniff." Feivke retreated into a corner and continued to stare at him in bewilderment. No sooner was it day than the davening recommenced with all the fervour of the night before. The room was as noisy and very soon nearly as hot, but it had not the same effect on Feivke as yesterday, and he was no longer frightened of Anishka and the stone. The whole dream had dissolved into thin air. When they once more brought out the Sefer Torah in its white mantle, Feivke was standing by the table and looked on indifferently when they uncovered the black, shining, crowded letters. He looked indifferently at the young man from town swaying over the Sefer Torah, out of which he read fluently, intoning with a strangely free and easy manner, like an adept to whom all this was nothing new. Whenever he stopped reading, he threw back his head and looked down at the people with a bright, satisfied smile. The little boys roamed up and down the room in socks with smelling salts in their hands, or yawned into their little siddurim. The air was filled with the dust of the trampled hay. The sun looked in at a window, and the soul lights grew dim as in a mist. It seemed to Feivke that he had been at the minyan a long, long time, and he felt as though some great misfortune had befallen him. Fear and wonder continued to oppress him, but not the fear and wonder of yesterday. He was tired, his body burning, while his feet were contracted with cold. He got away outside, stretched himself out on the grass behind the inn, and dozed, facing the sun. He dozed there through a good part of the day. Bright red rivers flowed before his eyes, and they made his brains ache. Someone, he did not know who, stood over him and never stopped rocking to and fro and reciting prayers. Then, It was his father bending over him with a rather troubled look, and waking him in a strangely gentle voice. "Well, Feivke, are you asleep? You've had nothing to eat today yet?"
"No."
Feivke followed his father back into the house on his unsteady feet. Weary Jews with pale and lengthened noses were resting on the terrace and on the benches. The sun was already low down over the village and shining full into the inn windows. Feivke stood by one of the windows with his father, and his head swam from the bright light. Mattes stroked his beard continually, and there was more davening and more rocking while they recited the Shemona Esrei. The benedictions ended. The young man began to trill, but in a weaker voice and without charm. He was sick of the whole thing, and kept it on in the half-hearted way with which one does a favour. Mattes forgot to look at his prayer book, and, standing in the window, gazed at the tree-tops which had caught fire in the rays of the setting sun. Nobody was expecting anything of him, when he suddenly gave a sob, so loud and so piteous that all turned and looked at him in astonishment. Some of the people laughed. The Baal Tefillah had just intoned "Michael on the right hand uttereth praise" out of the afternoon service. What was there to cry about in that? All the little boys had assembled round Mattes the smith and were choking with laughter, and a certain youth, the host's new son-in-law, gave a twitch to Mattes' tallis. "Reb Kozlova, you've made a mistake." Mattes answered not a word. The little fellow with the freckles pushed his way up to him, and, imitating the young man's intonation, repeated, "Reb Kozlova, you've made a mistake." Feivke looked wildly round at the bystanders, at his father. Then he suddenly advanced to the freckled boy and glared at him with his black eyes. You, Kob Tibi Bisi," he hissed in Little Russian. The laughter and commotion increased. There was an exclamation, "Rascal, in a holy place!" and another, "Aha, the Kozlova smith's boy must be a first-class scamp." The prayer leader thumped angrily on his prayer book because no one was listening to him. Feivke escaped once more behind the inn, but the whole company of boys followed him, headed by Leibrutz the driver. "There he is, the Kozlov lazy booby," screamed the freckled boy. "Have you ever heard the like? He actually wanted to fight again. And in our house. What do you think of that?" Leibrutz went up to Feivke at a steady trot, and with the gesture of one who likes to do what has to be done, calmly and coolly. "Wait, boys, hands off. We've got a remedy for him here, for which I hope he will be thankful." So saying, he deliberately took hold of Feivke from behind by his two arms and made a sign to the boy with the yellow hair. "Now for it, Aronchka. Give it to the youngster." The little boy immediately whipped the smelling bottle out of his pocket, took out the stopper with a flourish, and held it to Feivke's nose. The next moment Feivke had wrenched himself free and was making for the chicken face with nails spread, when he received two smart-sounding boxes on the ears from two great, heavy, horny hands, which so clouded his brain for a minute that he stood dazed and dumb. Suddenly he made a spring at Leibrutz, fell upon his hand, and fastened his sharp teeth in the flesh. Leibrutz gave a loud yell. There was a great to-do. People came running out in their robes. Women with pale, startled faces called to their children. A few of them reproved Mattes for his son's behaviour. Then they dispersed, till there remained behind the inn only Mattes and Feivke. Mattes looked at his boy in silence. He was not a talkative man, and he found only 2 or 3 words to say. "Feivke, mother there at home?" And you here? Again Feivke found himself alone on the field, and again he stretched himself out and dozed. Again, too, the red streams flowed before his eyes, and someone unknown to him stood at his head and recited prayers. Only the streams were thicker and darker, and the davening over his head was louder, sadder, more penetrating. It was quite dark when Mattes came out again, took Feivke by the hand, set him on his feet, and said, "Now we are going home." Indoors everything had come to an end, and the room had taken on a weekday look. The candles were gone, and a lamp was burning above the table, round which sat men in their hats and usual cloaks, no robes to be seen, and partook of some refreshment. There was no more davening, but in Feivke's ears was the same ringing of bells. It now seemed to him that he saw the room and the men for the first time, and the old Jew sitting at the head of the table, presiding over bottles and wine-glasses, and clicking with his tongue, could not possibly be the old man with the silver-white beard who had held up the Sefer Torah to his breast. Mattes went up to the table, gave a cough, bowed to the company, and said, "Shana Tova." The old man raised his head and thundered so loudly that Feivke's face twitched with pain. "Ha?" "I said I am just going home home again, so I wish you a Shana Tova, a good year." "Ha, a good year? A good year to you also. Wait, have a little brandy, huh?" Feivke shut his eyes. It made him feel bad to have the lamp burning so brightly, and the old man talking so loud. Why need he speak in such a high, rasping voice that went through one's head like a saw? "Ha! Is it your little boy who scratched my Aronchka's face? Ha! A rascal is he? Beat him well. There, give him a little brandy too, and a bit of cake. He fasted too, huh? But he can't recite the prayers? Fie! You ought to be beaten. Ha! Are you going home? Go in health. Ha! Your wife has just been confined. Perhaps you need some money for the holidays. Ha! What do you say?" Mattes and Feivke started to walk home. Mattes gave a look at the clear sky, where the young half-moon had floated into view. "Mother will be expecting us," he said, and began to walk quickly. Feivke could hardly drag his feet. On the tall bridge they were met by a cool breeze blowing from the water. Once across the bridge, Mattes again quickened his pace. Presently he stopped to look around. No Feivke. He turned back and saw Feivke sitting in the middle of the road. The child was huddled up in a silent, shivering heap. His teeth chattered with cold. "Feivke, what is the matter? Why are you sitting down? Come along home." "I won't," Feivke chattered out with his teeth. "I can't." "Did they hit you so hard, Feivke?" Feivke was silent. Then he stretched himself out on the ground, his hands and feet quivering. "Cold." "Aren't you well, Feivke?" The child made an effort, sat up and looked fixedly at his father with his black, feverish eyes, and suddenly he asked, "Why did you cry there, Tati? Why? Tell me why." "Where did I cry, you little silly? Why, I just cried. It's Yom Kippur. Mother is fasting too. Get up, Feivke, and come home. Mother will make you a poultice," occurred to him as a happy thought. "No, why did you cry while they were laughing?" Feivke insisted, still sitting in the road and shaking like a leaf. One mustn't cry when they laugh, one mustn't." And he lay down again on the damp ground. "Feivke, come home, my son." Mattes stood over the boy in despair, and looked around for help. From some way off, from the tall bridge, came a sound of heavy footsteps growing louder and louder, and presently the moonlight showed the figure of a peasant. "Hey, who's that? Matka the smith? What are you doing there? Are you casting spells? Who is that lying on the ground?" "I don't know myself what I'm doing, kind soul. That is my boy, and he won't come home, or he can't. What am I to do with him?" complained Matzes to the peasant, whom he knew. "Has he gone crazy? Give him a kick. Oh, you lazy little devil, get up." Feivke did not move from the spot. He only shivered silently, and his teeth chattered. "Oh, you devil, what sort of a boy have you there, Matka? A visitation of heaven. Why don't you beat him more? The other day they came and told tales of him. Agapa said that—" "I don't know either, kind soul, what sort of a boy he is," answered Matzes, and wrung his hands in desperation. Early next morning Matzes hired a conveyance and drove Feivke to the town, to the asylum for the sick poor. The smith's wife came out and saw them start, and she stood a long while in the doorway by the mezuzah. And on another fine autumn morning, just when the villagers were beginning to cart loads of fresh earth to secure the village against overflowing streams, the village boys told one another the news of Feivke's death. End of Country Folk by Isaac Dov Berkowitz. Section 48 of Yiddish Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yiddish Tales translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. Section 48. The Last of Them by Isaac Dov Berkowitz. They had been Rabbonim for generations in the misnagid community of Moravanka. Old, poverty-stricken Moravanka, crowned with hoary honour, hidden away in the thick woods. Generation on generation of them had been renowned far and near, whenever a Jewish word was spoken, whenever the voice of the Torah rang out in the warm old houses of study. People talked of them everywhere, as they talk of miracles when miracles are no more, and of consolation when all hope is long since dead, talked of them as great-grandchildren talk of the riches of their great-grandfather, the like of which are now unknown, and the great seven-branched old-fashioned lamp which he left them as an inheritance of times gone by. For as the lustre of an old seven-branched lamp shining in the darkness, such was the lustre of the Rabbonim of Moravanka. That was long ago, ever so long ago, when Moravanka lay buried in the dark Lithuanian forests. The old, low, moss-grown houses were still set in wide green gardens, wherein grew beetroot and onion, while the hop twined itself and clustered thickly along the wooden fencing. Well-to-do Jews still went about in linen pelisses and smoked pipes filled with dry herbs. People got a living out of the woods, where they burned pitch the whole week through, and Jewish families ate rye bread and groat's pottage. A new baby brought no anxiety along with it. People praised God, carried the pitcher to the well, filled it, and poured a quart of water into the pottage. The newcomer was one of God's creatures, and was assured of his portion along with the others. And if a Jew had a marriageable daughter and could not afford a dowry, he took a stick in his hand, donned a white shirt with a broad mangled collar, repeated the Tefillas Haderech, the prayer of the highway, and set off on foot to Volhynia, that thrice-blessed wonderland, where people talk with a chirek, and ate challah with saffron even in the middle of the week, with saffron if not with honey. There in Volhynia on Friday evenings the rich Jewish householder of the district walks to and fro leisurely in his brightly lit room. In all likelihood he is a short, plump, hairy man, with a broad, fair beard, a gathered silk sash round his substantial figure, a cheery, sing-song Sholem Alechem on his mincing, chirchy tongue, and a merry crack of the thumb. The Lithuanian guest, teacher or preacher, the shrunk and shrivelled stranger with the piercing black eyes, sits in a corner, merely moving his lips and gazing at the floor, perhaps because he feels ill at ease in the brightly, nicely furnished room, perhaps because he is thinking of his distant home, of his wife and children, and his marriageable daughter, and perhaps it has suddenly all become oddly dear to him, his poor, forsaken native place, with its moiling, poverty-struck Jews, whose week is spent pitch-burning in the forest, with its old warm houses of study, and its celebrated giants of the Torah, bending with a candle in their hand over the great hoary Gemorah. And here, at table, between the tasty stuffed fish and the soup, with the rich Volhynian stuffed monkeys, the brusque, tongue-tied guest is suddenly unable to contain himself, and overflows with talk about his corner in Lithuania. Whether we have our rabbis at home? No, no. And thereupon he holds forth grandiloquently, with an ardour and incisiveness born of the love and the longing at his heart. The piercing black eyes shoot sparks as the guest tells of the great men of Moravanka, with their fiery intellects, the great iron perseverance, who sit over their books by day and by night. But time to time they take an hour and a half's doze, falling with their heads onto their fists, their beards sweeping the Gemorah, a big candle keeping watch overhead and waking them once more to the study of the Torah. At dawn, when people begin to come in for the morning prayer, they walk round them on tiptoe, giving them their 4 ells distance, and avoiding meeting their look, which is apt to be sharp and burning. That is the way we study in Lithuania. The stout, hairy householder, good-natured and credulous, listens attentively to the wonderful tales, loosens the sash over his pelisse in leisurely fashion, unbuttons his waistcoat across his generous waist, blows out his cheeks, and sways his head from side to side, because one may believe anything of the Lithuanians. Then, if once in a long, long while the rich Volhynian householder stumbled, by some miracle or another, into Lithuania, sheer curiosity would drive him to take a look at the Lithuanian celebrity. But he would stand before him in trembling and astonishment, as one stands before a high granite rock, the summit of which can barely be discerned. Is he terrified by the dark and bushy brows, the keen penetrating looks, the deep stern wrinkles on the forehead that might have been carved in stone, they are so stiffly fixed? Who can say? Or is he put out of countenance by the cold, hard assertiveness of their speeches, which bore into the conscience like a gimlet, and knows of no mercy? For from between those wrinkles, from beneath those dark brows, shines out the everlasting glory of the Shekhinah. Such were the celebrated Rabbonim of Moravanka. They were an old family, a long chain of great men, generation on generation of tall, well-built, large-boned Jews, all far on in years, with thick curly beards. It was very seldom that one of those beards showed a silver of hair. They were stern, silent men, who heard and saw everything, but who expressed themselves mostly by means of their wrinkles and their eyebrows rather than in words, and that when a Mouravanke Rav went so far as to say "Nu," that was enough. The dignity of Rav was hereditary among them, descending from father to son, and together with the rabbinical position and the 18 gulden a week salary, the son inherited from his father a tall old reading desk, smoked and scorched by the candles in the old house of study in the corner by the ark, and a thick, heavily knotted stick, and an old holiday pelisse of lustrine, the which, if worn on a bright Sabbath day in summer-time, shines in the sun and fairly shouts to be looked at. They arrived in Mouravanke generations ago, when the town was still in the power of wild highwaymen, called there Haidmakyas, of huge, terrifying whiskers and large, savage dogs. One day, on Hoshana Rabbah, early in the morning, there entered the Beth HaMedrash a tall youth, evidently village-born, and from a long way off, barefoot, with turned-up trousers, his boots slung on a big knotted stick across his shoulders, and a great bundle of big hashonas, willow branches. The youth stood in the centre of the house of study with his mouth open, bewildered, and the boys quickly snatched his willow branches from him. He was surrounded, stared at, questioned as to who he was, whence he came, and what he wanted. Had he parents? Was he married? For some time the youth stood silent, with downcast eyes. Then he bethought himself, and answered in 3 words, "I want to study." And from that moment he remained in the old building, and people began to tell wonderful tales of his power of perseverance, of how a tall, barefoot youth, who came walking from a far distance, had, by dint of determination, come to be reckoned among the great men in Israel, of how, on a winter midnight, he would open the stove doors and study by the light of the glowing coals, of how he once forgot food and drink for 3 days and 3 nights running, while he stood over a difficult legal problem with wrinkled brows, his eyes piercing the page, his fingers stiffening round the handle of his stick, and he motionless. And when suddenly he found the solution, he gave a shout, "Nu!" and came down so hard on the desk with his stick that the whole Beth HaMedrash shook. It happened just when the people were standing quite quiet, repeating the Shemona Esrei. Then it was told how this same lad became Rav in Mouravanke, how his genius descended to his children and children's children till late in the generations, gathering in might with each generation in turn. They rose, these giants, one after the other, persistent investigators of the law, with high wrinkled foreheads, dark bushy brows, a hard cutting glance, sharp as steel. In those days Mouravanke was illuminated as with 7 suns. The houses of study were filled with students. Voices, young and old, rang out over the Gemorahs, sang, wept, and implored. Worried and tired-looking fathers and uncles would come into the shuls with blackened faces after the day's pitch-burning, between afternoon and evening prayer, range themselves in leisurely mood by the doors and the stove, cock their ears and listen. Jewish drivers who convey people from one town to another snatched a minute the first thing in the morning and dropped in with their whips under their arms to hear a passage in the Gemorah expounded. And the women, who washed the linen at the pump in summer-time, beat the wet clothes to the melody of the Torah that came floating into the street through the open windows, sweet as a long-expected piece of good news. Thus Moravanka came to be of great renown, because the wondrous power of the Moravanka Rabbonim, the power of concentration of thought, grew from generation to generation. And in those days the old people went about with a secret whispering, that if there should arise a 10th generation of the mighty ones, a new thing, please God, would come to pass among Jews. But there was no 10th generation. The 9th of the Moravanka Rabbonim was the last of them. He had 2 sons, but there was no luck in the house in his day. The sons philosophized too much, asked too many questions, took strange paths that led them far away. Once a rumour spread in Moravanka that the Rav's eldest son had become celebrated in the great world because of a book he had written, and had acquired the title of Professor. When the old Rav was told of it, he at first remained silent, with downcast eyes. Then he lifted them and ejaculated, "No." Not a word more. It was only remarked that he grew paler, that his look was even more piercing, more searching than before. This is all that was ever said in the town about the Rav's children, for no one cared to discuss a thing on which the old Rav himself was silent. Once, however, on Shabbos Hagadol, something happened in the spacious old Bes HaMedrash. The Rav was standing by the Aron HaKodesh, wrapped in his tallis, and expounding to a crowded congregation. He had a clear, resonant, deep voice, and when it sent thundering over the heads of the people, the air seemed to catch fire, and they listened dumbfounded and spellbound. Suddenly the old man stopped in the midst of his exposition and was silent. The congregation thrilled with speechless expectation. For a minute or two the Rav stood with his piercing gaze fixed on the people. Then he deliberately pulled aside the curtain before the Aron HaKodesh, opened the ark doors, and turned to the congregation. "Listen, Jews. I know that many of you are thinking of something that has just occurred to me too. You wonder how it is that I should set myself up to expound the Torah to a town full of Jews, when my own children have cast the Torah behind them. Therefore I now open the ark and declare to you, Jews, before the holy scrolls of the law, I have no children any more. I am the last Rav of our family." Hereupon a piteous wail came out of the women's shul, but the Rav's sonorous voice soon reduced them to silence, and once more the Torah was being expounded in thunder over the heads of the open-mouthed assembly. Years, a whole decade of them, passed, and still the old Rav walked erect, and not one silver hair showed in his curly beard, and the town was still used to see him before daylight, a tall, solitary figure, carrying a stick and a lantern, on his way to the large old Bes HaMedrash, to study there in solitude, until Moravanka began to ring with the fame of her Charif, her great new scholar. He was the son of a poor tailor, a pale, thin youth, with a pointed nose and 2 sharp black eyes, who had gone away at 13 or so to study in celebrated distant academies. Hence his name had spread round and round. People said of him that he was growing up to be a light of the exile, that with his scholastic achievements he could outwit the acutest intellects of all past ages. They said that he possessed a brain power that ground mountains of Talmud to powder. News came that a quantity of prominent Jewish communities had sent messengers to ask him to come and be their Rav. Moravanka was stirred to its depths. The householders went about greatly perturbed, because their Rav was an old man. His days were numbered, and he had no children to take his place. So they came to the old Rav in his house to ask his advice, whether it was possible to invite the Moravanka Charif, the tailor's son, to come to them, so that he might take the place of the Rav on his death, in 120 years, seeing that the said young Charif was a scholar distinguished by the acuteness of his intellect, the only man worthy of sitting in the seat of the Moravanka Rabbonim. The old Rav listened to the householders with lowering brows, and never raised his eyes, and he answered them one word: "Nu." So Moravanka sent a messenger to the young Charif, offering him the rabbinate. The messenger was swift, and soon the news spread through the town that the Charif was approaching. When it was time for the householders to go forth out of the town to meet the young Charif, the old Rav offered to go with them, and they took a chair for him to sit on while he waited at the meeting place. This was by the wood outside of the town, where all through the week the Jewish townfolks earned their bread by burning pitch. Begrimed and toil-worn Jews were continually dropping their work and peeping out shamefacedly between the tree stems. It was Friday, a clear day in the autumn. She appeared out of a great cloud of dust, she, the travelling wagon, in which sat the celebrated young Charif. Sholem Alechems flew to meet him from every side, and his old father, the tailor, leant back against a tree and wept aloud for joy. Now the old Rav declared that he would not allow the Charif to enter the town till he had heard him, the Charif, expound a portion of the Torah. The young man accepted the condition. Men, women, and little children stood expectant. All eyes were fastened on the tailor's son. All hearts beat rapidly. The Charif expounded the Torah standing in the wagon. At first he looked fairly scared, and his sharp black eyes darted fearfully hither and thither over the heads of the silent crowd. But then came a bright idea and lit up his face. He began to speak, but his was not the familiar teaching, such as everyone learns and understands. His words were like fiery flashes, appearing and disappearing one after the other, lightnings that traverse and illuminate half the sky in 1 second of time, a play of swords in which there are no words, only the clink and ring of finely tempered steel. The old Rav sat in his chair, leaning on his old, knobbly, knotted stick, and listened. He heard, but evil thoughts beset him, and deep, hard wrinkles cut themselves into his forehead. He saw before him the Charif, the dried-up youth with the sharp eyes and the sharp pointed nose, and the evil thought came to him, "Those are needles, a tailor's needles," while the long, thin forefinger with which the Charif pointed rapidly in the air seemed a third needle wielded by a tailor in a hurry. "You prick more sharply even than your father," is what the old Rav wanted to say when the Charif ended his sermon, but he did not say it. The whole assembly was gazing with caught breath at his half-closed eyelids. The lids never moved, and some thought wonderingly if he had fallen into a doze from sheer old age. Suddenly a strange dry snap broke the stillness. The old Rav started in his chair, and when they rushed forward to assist him, they found that his knotted, knobbly stick had broken in two. Pale and bent, for the first time, but a tall figure still, the old Rav stood up among his startled flock. He made a leisurely motion with his hand in the direction of the town, and remarked quietly to the young Charif, "Nu, now you can go into the town." That Friday night the old Rav came into the Bes HaMedrash without his satin cloak, like a mourner. The congregation saw him lead the young Rav into a corner near the Aron HaKodesh, where he sat him down by the high old bema, saying, "You will sit here." He himself went and sat down behind the pulpit among the strangers, the Sabbath guests. For the first minute people were lost in astonishment. The next minute the house of study was filled with wailing. Young and old lifted their voices in lamentation. The young Rav looked like a child sitting behind the tall desk, and he shivered and shook as though with fever. Then the old Rav stood up to his full height and commanded, "People are not to weep." All this happened about the solemn days. Mouravanke remembers that time now, and speaks of it at dusk, when the sky is red as though streaming with fire, and the men stand about pensive and forlorn, and the women fold their babies closer in their aprons. At the close of the Day of Atonement there was a report that the old Rav had breathed his last in kittel and tallis. But the young Charif did not survive him long. He died at his father's, the tailor, and his funeral was on a wet Hoshana Rabbah day. Aged folk said he had been summoned to face the old Rav in a lawsuit in the heavenly court. End of The Last of Them by Isaac Dov Berkowitz. Section 49, the last section of Yiddish Tales, translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 49, The Clever Rabbi, a folk tale by Anonymous. The power of man's imagination, said my grandmother, is very great. Hereby hangs a tale which, to our sorrow, is a true one, and as clear as daylight. Listen attentively, Yingele, it will interest you very much. Not far from this town of ours lived an old count, who believed that Jews require blood at Passover, Christian blood too, for their Passover matzah. The Count, in his brandy distillery, had a Jewish overseer, a very honest, respectable fellow. The Count loved him for his honesty, and was very kind to him, and the Jew, though he was a simple man and no scholar, was very well disposed, and served the Count with heart and soul. He would have gone through fire and water at the Count's bidding, for it is in the nature of a Jew to be faithful and to love good men. The Count often discussed business matters with him, and took pleasure in hearing about the customs and observances of the Jews. One day the Count said to him, "Tell me the truth. Do you love me with your whole heart?" "Yes," replied the Jew, "I love you as myself." "Not true," said the Count. "I shall prove to you that you hate me even unto death." "Hold!" cried the Jew. "Why does my lord say such terrible things?" The Count smiled and answered, "Let me tell you. I know quite well that Jews must have Christian blood for their Passover feast. Now, what would you do if I were the only Christian you could find? You would have to kill me, because the rabbis have said so. Indeed, I can scarcely hold you to blame, since, according to your false notions, the divine command is precious, even when it tells us to commit murder. I should be no more to you than was Isaac to Abraham, when, at God's command, Abraham was about to slay his only son. Know, however, that the God of Abraham is a God of mercy and loving kindness, while the God the rabbis have created is full of hatred towards Christians. How then can you say you love me?" The Jew clapped his hands to his head. He tore his hair in distress and felt no pain, and with a broken heart he answered the Count and said, "How long will you Christians suffer this stain on your pure hearts? How long will you disgrace yourselves? Does not my Lord know that this is a great lie? I, as a believing Jew, and many beside me as believing Jews, we ourselves, I say, with our own hands grind the corn. We keep the flour from getting damp or wet with anything, for if only a little dew drop onto it, it is prohibited for us as though it had yeast. Till the day on which the matzah is baked, we keep the flour as the apple of our eye. And when the flour is baked, and we are eating the matzah, even then we are not sure of swallowing it, because if our gums should begin to bleed, we have to spit the piece out. And in face of all these stringent regulations against eating the blood of even beasts and birds, some people say that Jews require human blood for their Passover matzah, and swear to it as a fact. What does my Lord suppose we are likely to think of such people? We know that they swear falsely, and a false oath is of all things the worst." The Count was touched to the heart by these words, and these two men, being both upright and without guile, believed one the other. The Count believed the Jew. That is, he believed that the Jew did not know the truth of the matter because he was poor and untaught, while the rabbis all the time most certainly used blood at Passover, only they kept it a secret from the people. And he said as much to the Jew, who, in his turn, believed the Count because he knew him to be an honourable man. And so it was that he began to have his doubts. And when the Count on different occasions repeated the same words, the Jew said to himself that perhaps after all it was partly true, that there must be something in it. The Count would never tell him a lie. And he carried the thought about with him for some time. Now the Jew found increasing favour in his master's eyes. The Count lent him money to trade with, and God prospered the Jew in everything he undertook. Thanks to the Count, he grew rich. The Jew had a kind heart and was much given to good works, as is the way with Jews. He was very charitable and succoured all the poor in the neighbouring town, and he assisted the rabbis and the pious in all the places round about, and earned for himself a great and beautiful name, for he was known to all as the benefactor. The rabbis gave him the honour due to a pious and influential Jew who is a wealthy man and charitable into the bargain. But the Jew was thinking, "Now the rabbis will let me into the secret which is theirs, and which they share only with those who are at once pious and rich, that great and pious Jews must have blood for the Passover." For a long time he lived in hope, but the rabbis told him nothing. The subject was not once mentioned. But the Jew felt sure that the Count would never have lied to him, and he gave more liberally than before, thinking, perhaps after all it was too little. He assisted the rabbi of the nearest town for a whole year, so that the rabbi opened his eyes in astonishment. He gave him more than half of what is sufficient for a livelihood. When it was near Passover, the Jew drove into the little town to visit the rabbi, who received him with open arms and gave him honour unto the most powerful and wealthy benefactor, and all the representative men of the community paid him their respects. Thought the Jew, now they will tell me of the commandment which is not given to every Jew to observe. As the rabbi, however, told him nothing, the Jew remained to remind the rabbi, as it were, of his duty. "Rabbi," said the Jew, "I have something very particular to say to you. Let us go into a room where we two shall be alone." So the rabbi went with him into an empty room, shut the door, and said, "Dear friend, what is your wish? Do not be abashed, but speak freely, and tell me what it is I can do for you." "Dear Rabbi, I am, you must know, already acquainted with the fact that Jews require blood at Passover. I know also that it is a secret belonging only to the rabbis, to very pious Jews, and to the wealthy who give much alms. And I, who am, as you know, a very charitable and good Jew, wish also to comply, if only once in my life, with this great observance. You need not be alarmed, dear Rabbi. I will never betray the secret, but will make you happy forever, if you will enable me to fulfill so great a command. If, however, you deny its existence and declare that Jews do not require blood, from that moment I become your bitter enemy. And why should I be treated worse than any other pious Jew? I too want to perform the great mitzvah which God gave in secret. I am not learned in the law, but a great and wealthy Jew, and one given to good works. That I am in very truth." You can fancy, said my grandmother, the rabbi's horror on hearing such words from a Jew, a simple countryman. They pierced him to the quick, like sharp arrows. He saw that the Jew believed in all sincerity that his co-religionists used blood at Passover. How was he to uproot out of such a simple heart the weeds sown there by evil men? The rabbi saw that words would just then be useless. A beautiful thought came to him, and he said, "So be it, dear friend. Come into the synagogue tomorrow at this time, and I will grant your request. But till then you must fast, you must not sleep all night, but watch in prayer, for this is a very grave and dreadful thing." The Jew went away full of gladness, and did as the rabbi had told him. Next day, at the appointed time, he came again, worn with hunger and lack of sleep. The rabbi took the key of the synagogue, and they went in there together. In the synagogue all was quiet. The rabbi put on a tallis and a kittel, lighted some black candles, threw off his shoes, took the Jew by the hand, and led him up to the ark. The rabbi opened the ark, took out a Sefer Torah, and said,
You know that for us Jews the scroll of the law is the most sacred of all things, and that the list of denunciations occurs in it twice. I swear to you by the scroll of the law, if any Jew, whosoever he be, requires blood at Passover, may all the curses contained in the 2 lists of denunciations be on my head, and on the head of my whole family. The Jew was greatly startled. He knew that the Rabbi had never before sworn an oath, and now, for his sake, he had sworn an oath so dreadful. The Jew wept much, and said, "Dear Rabbi, I have sinned before God and before you. I pray you, pardon me and give me some hard penance, as hard as you please. I will perform it willingly, and may God forgive me likewise." The Rabbi comforted him and told no one what had happened. He only told a few very near relations, just to show them how people can be talked into believing the greatest foolishness and the most wicked lies. "May God," said my grandmother, "open the eyes of all who accuse us falsely, that they may see how useless it is to trump up against us things that never were seen or heard. Jews will be Jews while the world lasts, and they will become, through suffering, better Jews with more Jewish hearts. End of The Clever Rabbi, a folk tale by Anonymous. End of Yiddish Tales, translated by Helena Frank and read by Adrian Praetzellis in Santa Rosa, California, 21st of Nisan in the year 5771. That's April 25th, 2011.